Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Here.
Ms. Shenoweth?
Present.
Mr. Hayes?
Present.
Ms. Pat?
Present.
Mr. Roberts?
Present.
Mr. Whalen? Ms. Wyman?
Present.
Mayor Satterthwaite?
Here.
It would appear that we have a quorum. Are there any additions to the agenda?
I'd like to, if it's okay with council, I'd like to move item 10 up to number 5, since majority is here, or here on the room.
Without objection, I think that would be appropriate. Do we have minutes from the previous meeting?
Move approval.
Second. We have a motion and a second. Are there any discussion related to the minutes?
Thank you.
Councilman Pat?
2 words need to be corrected on the top of page 2 under committee member input. In the first sentence, the word acquisitions, I think, should be statements or something like that, responding to inaccurate statements that were made. And in the third line, our ordinance is called the Human Rights Ordinance, not Human Relations Ordinance.
Does anyone object to those corrections? Are there further corrections? In that case, all in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are approved. Next on our agenda is public input. Given that we have moved the agenda item related to the single-family rental housing registration to the top, we have basically everyone in the audience except for one has asked to speak on that issue. I'd like to take the one person who is speaking on a different issue tonight first, and then allow everyone to speak with regard to the single-family rental housing registration program. So if we could hear from Tammy Tunnell, representing A Women's Fund, Inc.
Thank you. I'll just take a few minutes of your time. I know you have a very full agenda, and I don't want to crowd it. I only bring this to your attention tonight because I believe the city of Champaign is discussing it tomorrow night at their city council, and that is the loss of the HUD funding that happened to the 3 local shelters. And our continuum of care is trying to identify possible solutions for money for a 7-month gap, because we can get the money back come February. So I believe what's on the table is there was a memorandum that went out, and I don't know if you have received this or not, but it was supposed to have gone out from the continuum. I can leave a copy with you. That's just asking the cities to come together, the United Way, the Mental Health Board, and anybody else that could step forward and help us with that 7-month gap. So that's the issue, and I don't think it bears a discussion tonight, but it is going to be on the table.
Well, I appreciate your statement. Does anyone have any questions? Ms. Wyman?
I just want to ask if the clerk can make copies of those for the rest of the council before the meeting's over, so we could get those. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you get that to the clerk here? Okay. Thank you. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the discussion of single-family rental housing registration program, which comes to us from the February 14 committee meeting, presented by Ms. Pat. We have a number of people who would like to speak both in favor and against this. My only request would be that people attempt to keep their comments brief. We have a lot of people to hear from, and we would ask you to limit your comments to 5 minutes and try to avoid repeating what people before you may have already said. The first person we're hearing from is Gabe, representing himself, 2409 North High Cross Road on this agenda item.
Good evening. Obviously, we're back to where we started. You know, this whole thing started, I think, with the zoning, maybe 15 years ago, when you started spot zoning, downgrading some areas, etc. And the whole idea, I think, you know, I know you're going to pass it. You know, I mean, there's no reason almost discussing it. When you guys make up your minds, you do what you want to do, whether we oppose it or not. So, but I'll just tell you how I feel and how a lot of people feel. The idea is basically to keep students away from living in that area. That's really what the whole agenda is. You know, I just read through what the statements of your last week's meeting. You talk about, you know, the foreign-related thing, but it would not apply to professors on sabbatical. You know, you nailed it on the head. It's the professors you are trying to protect. You know, the professors make their income from students, but they don't want to live around students. Well, there's not much any of us can say or do, but one day I think Urbana might overplay its hand and get in serious trouble. You know, I, for one, I don't, it doesn't bother me because I know you'll do what you have to do. But at this time, I think I would mention to people in the audience here, if anybody has single houses that they might want to sell because of this ordinance, please call me, Gabe, 359-0700. Yes. What I'm going to do is this. There are 90 I was talking to the president of Lakeside Terrace, and she tells me that the people who live in subsidized housing, there are 90 families that have vouchers, Section 8. So I'm going to buy as many single-family homes, and for once, I'll give the poor a chance to live next to professors. You guys talk about caring for the poor, and usually you end it up with minorities and children, and which means that minorities need to be protected just like children. Okay, we're going to get as many Section 8 tenants as possible to come live in West Urbana. You say it's historic. We'll see how historic it is. And I was talking to one of the mothers. She has several teenage boys. And she just told me, she said, Gabe, thanks very much for giving us the opportunity to live close to professors who will be great role models for our children. And I promise you, my children will not gangbang. Oh, I said, don't worry. The professors know what gangbanging is, and they won't worry about it. And of course, this city is the same city that tells us that we cannot discriminate against people who have just come out of prison. So, some of these people out of prison have vouchers too. I will fill that whole area with Section 8. And you guys are, I think you don't want students there. At least some of those students, I don't think, commit the kind of crimes that you were looking at. Most of the police calls in this town are to the projects. But like I said, anybody interested who wants to sell a house, Gabe is willing to buy. And Section 8 is coming. We're bringing them in. Thank you. In fact, the last point here, the only good thing that probably has come out of this election is the fact that at least Lynn Barnes is going to be here. When Mayor Sadwaite suggested her name to be on the council, you guys voted her down. You say it was because she had not voted in 28 years. Well, what's the point? Why vote? When the inmates run the asylum, why vote? It makes no difference. You guys are smarter than everybody else. And besides, her resume is more impressive than anybody I look at here. So obviously the reason why you voted it down was because she's overqualified to sit with you guys. Thank you.
Are there any questions for the speaker?
We don't have questions.
There are no questions. Next, we'll hear from Liz Cardman of 708 West California.
Hi. I'd like to open with a quote, which, on my honor, I literally heard this afternoon at 4 o'clock in a lecture hall from the person behind me. I did not solicit this. He said, quote unquote, "Urbana now has this new," and I underline the word new, "ridiculous law that no more than 4 unrelated people can rent a house." I don't think it's a big stretch to realize that why a potential tenant thinks this is a new law is because it has long been violated and unenforced. So I'd like to put tonight's discussion within a broader context. Ms. Pat's proposed ordinance shouldn't be considered radical, controversial, or unique. Other towns have similar affidavit programs to address issues of over-occupancy, and I spoke with several towns today. Number 1, West Lafayette, Indiana. They have a rental registration program including this affidavit of occupancy. It's been in place since 1976. It's enforced throughout the city and applies to all areas zoned single-family. Fees are $150 per rental property. Inspection periods varies depending on location within the city. Newark, Delaware. They've been dealing with this problem since the 80s and currently have a student home zoning code regulations ordinance which was adopted in '99. It pertains to single-family units throughout the city. They have an annual fee of some $300 with annual inspections. Leases have to contain the legal number of occupants, and landlord must include this in a posting within the unit. And as the housing inspector said to me today on the phone, they consider preservation of the single-family residential neighborhoods vital for the health of the city. Third city, I spoke with someone in Iowa City today. They have an information disclosure and acknowledgement form which they adopted in 2002. These forms are not kept on file as a public document, but only if the city believes there is an occupancy violation at the property will they request to see them. And they, as well, are part of a larger rental inspection program, which charges, $110 per structure, additional fees per unit and bedroom. And inspections for single-family dwellings are every 3 years, and this has been in effect since the late 1970s. Rental permits, which include the legal number of occupants, are posted on the city's website for every single rental property. They're arranged by street. And again, according to the housing inspector I spoke with, he said Iowa City actually has more code violations with single-family properties and duplexes than they do with the larger multi-unit properties. And as he said, these properties tend to be older, built before current codes were established, and they're often managed by mom-and-pop landlords rather than professional property managers. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, I wasn't able to get hold of the housing inspector, but they clearly have an affidavit which is an addendum to their current residential rental agreement, and it's part of a larger licensing and inspection program. I know that affidavit's been in place for at least 3 or 4 years. And conclude with yet another quote. As Voltaire said, "The best is the enemy of the good." This program may not be comprehensive. It may have loopholes. However, it's not overly ambitious or burdensome to either tenants or landlords. It's a good start. I say let's go with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Next, we have Betsy Cronin, 305 West High.
Well, Liz set things in a larger context. I'd like to personalize it a little bit. When the house next door to us went on the market in 2001, my husband and I crossed our fingers in the hopes that it would go back to being single owner occupied. For the previous 4 years, it had been owned by out-of-town parents for their undergraduate son and other tenants. Not a weed had been pulled, not a blade of grass had been mown. Often I had to knock on the door and ask that they turn down the bass, which was invading my living room. I was tired of picking up cigarette butts from my front lawn. We had never really been quite sure how many people lived in the house because there were so many visitors day and night. Consequently, we never reported it as overoccupied. Then we discovered it was being sold fully leased to 5 tenants. We decided as a defense that our only option really was to buy it ourselves, and luckily we were in a financial position that we could do that. When I told the student owner that having 5 signed leases was illegal, his response was, "That can't be possible. I know lots of kids who live in Urbana houses with more than 4 people." Once we owned the house, despite having changed the tax designation from owner-occupied to non-owner-occupied, there was no information forthcoming from the city, no instructions on how we should deal with this as landlords. I took a class at Adult Ed and informed myself, but basically it's left to landlords to assume that responsibility. Some of us do, some of us don't. The proposed program, I think, would be a huge help in disseminating that information to registered owners. Some have suggested that the way to combat overoccupancy is to address the attendant problems, such as the parking, the litter, noise. I vehemently oppose this approach. It really puts the burden on the neighbors to be tattletales. At present, there's no systematic patrolling by the environmental control officer. He simply investigates complaints. This puts residents in the position of having to report. Far better to deal with the root of the problems in an honest, direct, effective way, which is what Ms. Pat has proposed here. The new regulation making it illegal to offer to rent is a good start. But having to register with the city and sign an affidavit will be much more effective. This is a, 20-plus-year-old regulation, which has really not been enforced in that period of time. It will clearly inform the small-time landlords about their responsibilities as well as the tenants about the limits. And it will also give the city the means to force compliance by the few chronic intentional offenders. Oh, and I wanted to add that we are still renting to students, just not 5. We don't make as much money as we did when it was rented to 5, but we are still making a profit. There's plenty of money to be made in Urbana by renting houses, and we don't have to stuff it full. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Next, we have, is it Sally Stocks-Eisfeld? If I misread your name, please correct me.
That's
Okay.
close. If it's close, I'm happy.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Sally Stocks-Eisfeld, with currently Vice President of Central Illinois Apartment Association. And I'm speaking in their behalf tonight. I also am a property owner of rental real estate in Urbana and manage units in Urbana as well. I appreciate that Ms. Pat has proposed a new city ordinance in which she wishes to address what she perceives as a problem in the residential district south of University, north of Florida, east of Wright, and west of Vine Street. Overoccupancy of rental properties. Overoccupancy is a negative condition that affects neighborhoods and landlords alike. To correctly evaluate the situation, we need accurate information and more current than was published in the News Gazette Saturday the 26th. It indicated the last study was over 20 years ago, 1985-ish, in which it indicated 40 violations. I have been informed that in the past year, only 7 violations were registered with the city of Urbana. Is this 7 of 70 homes or 7 of 700 homes? 1%, 10%? I question the judgment of necessity here. The population served in this segment of Urbana is quite diverse. It's multi-use already. It's a very, very dynamic neighborhood. The spectrum stretches from fraternities, sororities, apartments, UFI certified housing, all the way to single families. If overoccupancy is a resounding problem, Urbana currently has existing ordinances which need to be enforced. If lack of information is the reason for noncompliance, then education is the solution. If students have not been hearing the information from the tenant union, if property owners, single-family homeowners, rental real estate owners have not been hearing the information from the city, we need to take further steps of responsibility for education. I'm here proposing that the Central Illinois Apartment Association is ready and willing to assist with that dissemination of information. On a monthly basis, we come into touch with property owners who represent tens of thousands of rental dwelling units in the Champaign-Urbana communities. Let us publish articles about the information, about occupancy regulations, many different kinds, this as well as other things, about limits to the total number of occupants. Let us talk about it in our monthly meetings, and also have it in a written form to pass out at our trade shows, at our seminars, at all of our meetings. We're willing to disseminate the information. We have the laws and ordinances in Urbana in place. They have not been enforced. It is not necessary to create another layer of bureaucracy when you already have these laws and the conduit for the information in place as well. And our offer is to be of assistance in that fashion. Any questions? Yes, Esther.
Several members of your organization break the law every year. I know that. I don't know if you know that. What might your organization be able to do to get your own members to start complying with this law if we weren't to pass this ordinance?
We would be more than happy to sit down with you and take suggestions and see if there are some ways that we can help arrive at that conclusion or at that positive outcome, because we believe in compliance as well. We would welcome that further conversation with you.
Thank you. Is the Apartment Association opposed to occupancy limits in rental houses?
Opposed to occupancy limits? No.
No. Okay.
No. We're just saying that we have existing ordinances in place. It appears that there's been a lack of enforcement. And I also really appreciated what the property owner said who spoke before me, that where would she have gotten the information from the city of Urbana if she had not been willing to take those steps herself? Should this be a part of a closing of residential real estate? Maybe there's some ways we really need to examine of how we're putting the information out. We know of a way that we can help with the landlords, and we're willing to do it. There are probably numerous ways that none of us right here tonight have ever thought about of how to get it out to the property owners. It doesn't have to be punitive. It doesn't have to cost more money. Very frankly, if we're paying additional fees that are for registration of properties, the additional clerical hours that it costs to have these forms together, we've got to pass those costs on. There are ways to do this without having to form a department that has to keep these books and records updated on a monthly, annual basis. I believe that there's a way to find a solution to this with disseminating the information, and then, very frankly, prosecute, go after the people who don't comply.
Thank you.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
I think the newspaper pointed this out, that the laws for the occupancy of no more than 4 unrelated adults has been on the books for more than 20 years. I'm just wondering what your agency has done to disseminate that information.
Could you give me more information? Well, I'll answer that, but part of that question also goes with, why has it been the choice of this council, of this city, not to enforce that existing ordinance? Why have you chosen to be lax about that? That's a very strong question that needs to be, without fault-finding, needs to be answered as well. Very frankly, I don't think it's been brought to my attention as a board member of the Apartment Association to where it was something that I felt was an urgent need. No one from the council, no one from the tenant union, no one has stepped forward to say, by golly, we've got a problem with this and somebody's just not getting it. How can we get this information out there? No one's ever come forward and asked that. I know it's in my leases. I limit number of occupants in my leases. If they bring in other people and it becomes their permanent address, where they're receiving mail there on a regular basis. It's a violation of my lease. It's a breach of lease, and they have to go or they have to become compliant. Maybe there's something we can do with helping some property owners with lease language that does limit the number of their residents or occupants. There could be property owners who don't have that. But the question is on both sides of the table here. The question is, partially, why is there nonconformance to existing ordinances, but also why has there been non-enforcement of what has been existing? And if it has grown to be such a huge problem, why did we leave it alone for so long before addressing it? And I think that we can find a midline where we can have compliance, and that's what I look forward to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question, if I could.
Yes, sir.
I approached this when this idea was first presented to me from a very similar viewpoint to what you are articulating now. This notion that we already have these zoning controls. What do we need to do to enforce them? And the message that I've received from those within the city who have been responsible for enforcing these is that it's very difficult to determine who's actually living in a house, and that it's perhaps not a very efficient expenditure of the city's money to be out there staking out these houses to try to determine who's living there. I guess what I'm asking you is what I hear you saying, that regardless of the outcome of this ordinance, your organization is willing to work with your members, some of whom I understand have been sort of chronically in noncompliance, to ensure that this problem of over-occupancy and violation of the law is addressed?
Most definitely. We're about education and want the information out there. When we say chronically, again, something can be chronic if it is once every 10 years, but with some consistency. 7 violations out of what are the total number of residents? Properties there? Are we talking a 1% noncompliance? What are we talking about here? This is all very vague.
What I'm asking, and I'm sorry, is, if the city employees drive by a house and see the weeds aren't mowed, or there's garbage in the lawn, or this type of thing, that's something that is immediately objectively discernible, and they can say there's a problem here,
sure,
and we're going to find out who's responsible, and we're going to ask them to correct the problem. With over-occupancy, it's a little more subtle in that you can't just from the outside of the house determine, hey, there's 6 people living in this home. And I guess what I'm saying is, it would seem that an organization such as yours that is in touch with these landlords, even in the absence of this type of a program, is in probably the strongest position to do what the city cannot do, which is to stop this problem before it starts. And what I'm asking is, am I hearing that there's a commitment from your organization to do that?
Very definitely. However, there is also an obligation on the part of the city to have the information ready, available, and disseminated to people who are purchasing homes as well. It is not only the obligation of a professional organization to put the information out. So the city needs to fulfill their obligation as well. One thing that concerns me about what you said, the whole crux of this is that over-occupancy hinders the viability of a neighborhood. It goes at its underpinnings. It's going to cause it to tumble. Well, if those causes, or if those things are happening, if over-occupancy causes all of those things, you don't have to employ drive-bys to discern or determine that it's going by. It's going to be obvious.
Are you effectively saying then that the time to look at this problem is once the damage is done?
No, I'm effectively saying that I am saying that the effective way to handle the situation is information ahead of the game, before it ever gets started, before it becomes infectious, and before it balloons to something huge. I think it starts at the beginning, not waiting for it to get big at the end.
So your position would be that the landlords who are members of your organization, assuming there are, I'm not familiar with your membership list or with which particular houses are overoccupied, but if we were to postulate that there are perhaps members of your organization that have in the past overleased houses, your position would be that it's because they don't know that it's illegal to overlease these houses?
I think it would partially be to lack of information in some instances, very possibly. I think it could also be a failure to enforce what the laws are. If I can drive down Vine Street and the speed limit says 35 miles an hour and every car blows me by, I'll lay you odds human nature is I'm probably going to creep up to 38 or 40 miles an hour as well.
Saying that even the law-abiding landlords may say, hey, the city's letting these scofflaws get away with it, so we're going to do it too.
And the important thing is, before it has impact on the neighborhood, that we figure out a way to address this, not the end result by being punitive, but instead addressing the issue at the front end before it has to blow up into something that's unmanageable. Why not get it taken care of at the front end with good information, good education, getting this out at closings? I'm a strong believer that this information should be disseminated at all real estate closings. I think it should be for owner-occupied, non-owner-occupied, whatever. I think it should be done in all communities, anything that has to do with ordinances regarding occupancies.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you. Yes.
Just briefly, I want to understand your objection. What I have before me is a rental registration program where a landlord pays $10 for all of his or her units and doesn't have to pay that again or re-register unless a new property is acquired or management changes, essentially. And
or the tenancy changes.
The $10 fee is actually not for the tenancy. The affidavits are $3 a piece, and I assume that would be annual because generally that's how you rent to. So are you saying that you object to that rental registration program? I'm just trying to understand
we can start
if we're on the same
we're going to
page.
have to get into a list.
Okay.
Yes, I am opposed to that. I am opposed to selective enforcement. I am opposed to selective enforcement. I am opposed to something that creates another level of bureaucracy, which my city taxes have to pay for, which means somebody keeping track of all of this. I am opposed to fees, which I have to pass on to the resident. I have no choice. I can't keep absorbing them. Whatever. Yes, I'm opposed to it on multi-levels. And just the fact that it is just only one form per year or whatever, it still costs money to do that kind of thing. I would rather spend the money, the time, the energy, and the man-hours on checking on the property, making certain that my residents are compliant with what I'm informed that the laws and the rules are, and being able to spend my money on keeping the property upgraded. And I would hope that many landlords feel the same way and believe that they do.
Further questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next we have Linda Lorenz of 409 West High.
I'll just be short. I'm in favor of this, and I believe that with some effort, all of us can work on getting the little parts of it that we can't all agree on worked out, and that in the end it will maintain our neighborhood in a better situation.
Thank you. Any questions? Next we have Charlie Smythe of 805 South Kohler, who, I'm sorry, did not want to speak, but now does.
I'm Charlie Smythe, 805 South Kohler. Some things have been said that I think need to be emphasized here. We all have a tendency to have a knee-jerk reaction against any regulation that comes our way. I mean, I think that's sort of human nature. But what we're talking about here is trying to figure out a way to maintain single-family homes within a mixed-use environment. For the past 20 years, those of us who live in West Urbana have seen too much go on, too much of the property starting to decay. We need to put a stop to it. Clearly this is a very small ordinance in the sense of what it actually asks people to do. It's not going to cost very much. The costs are really very trivial. Hopefully it won't cost the city too much to do. But what it does do is it gives us a little bit extra leverage where we don't have current adequate laws to deal with over-occupancy violations, where we haven't been able to enforce the current occupancy rules because they're so hard to figure out whether somebody's there. And this addresses the previous speaker, is that we need a tool with which to enforce the existing regulations. We don't have something right now. This puts the minimum in place so that we can actually go about enforcing the current laws.
Any questions, Mr. Robbins?
Do you think that you were talking about the property decay? Do you think that that is that over-occupancy is the main cause for property decay in West Urbana?
What we've had is a tendency for single-family houses to be converted to rentals, and in turn those rentals get over-occupied. So it's a mix. There's an encouragement to buy these single-family homes and then just milk them for everything that you can. And so, we need to decide on a reasonable level of occupancy that will discourage just milking these things dry. I think it's one of the tools that can be used to help stop it. It won't be the end-all, be-all, clearly. Multiple things are needed, and I think this is the beginning of finding some solutions to stopping decay. What those other ones are, I think we need to look long-term and talk about some other things in the future.
I'm wondering if it's more significant that the homes are being turned into multi-person rentals, or whether it is that multi-person rentals that have already been converted have been over-occupied.
I don't know which way it is. All I know is that we've had more and more single-family homes in this neighborhood convert to rentals. There's a monetary attraction to do that. And
it might be a different issue. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I think other communities, what they do is the minimum occupancy isn't 4, it's 2 or 3. We're one of the few communities that has it as high as 4. If you look at West Lafayette, it's like 2 or something. Lawrence, Kansas is 3. There's a whole list of them, I think, that you've been supplied with. So maybe the issue is even allowing 4 is too many. It makes it too much of an attraction to have single-family homes converted to rentals. The biggest impact is, just so many cars, so many people on tiny lots, on tiny driveways. So you just get that constant effect, and the property owners of these single-family homes just don't put in what a person owning the home would do. They don't pick up the yard. They don't stay after the bushes, the trees, whatever. They don't keep the grass mowed nicely. The effort isn't put into taking care of these single-family homes that the large apartment buildings, for the majority, do. There's more taken care of, and I think it's interesting that it was pointed out that ordinance issues with larger properties are fewer than with these single-family smaller rental units. I think that's an interesting point that probably that's the kind of thing that maybe we need to look at in the future is how do we adequately address issues of maintenance and other things in these smaller rental units. And that would be far more burdensome on the property owners than this tiny little ordinance that gives us a tool to try to enforce the existing occupancy ordinance.
I just have a brief question. How do you feel about the notion of an ordinance that applies only to this district?
I'd like to see it applied to the whole city, but it's a start. And maybe this is a test case. And, there are other things that have had to be done to this area that aren't needed for the other parts of the city for the same reason. The parking ordinances on the street, because of the density, because of the mixed use of this neighborhood, it is a bit different from, say, East Urbana, where you just don't have university employees trying to park on your streets.
Thank you. Next we have Paul DeBevico of 708 West California.
Evening. Thanks for your time. I say DeBevic.
I'm sorry, it looked like a...
Not an easy name. All of us are here for a reason. I'm here to protect my home. I live in the 700 block of West California, a block in which there are only 3 owner-occupied homes. There have been some successes in this block. Kevin and Julie Webster have gorgeously restored 714 West California. They are Chicago residents and parents of UIUC graduates. A UIUC grad student, Theo Kachik, and his father have restored 711 West California, a property that was among the worst in all of Urbana. And recent ownership of 703 West California by Glenn Berman is indeed a very positive direction. I fear, and although it's dangerous to ascribe motives to others, that some who are addressing you are here to protect their profit margin. And indeed, there is a profit margin to protect here. Alan Nudo, who I believe may even be in the audience, gives an excellent course at the Urbana Adult School. He is associated with Robeson Real Estate. He points out that money left the stock market both nationally and locally, and a lot of this money actually ended up in rental property. And the rate of return locally moved down from 10 to 12% to 6 to 9%. So indeed, there's a strong motive to try to, by over-occupancy, increase the profits of a property. Just because there are not recently many reported violations, in fact, the system has not worked for so long that most have concluded that reporting violations has been useless. If I could share with you just a portion of an email now 3 years old from Mike Nichols. Mr. Nichols, before his death, was in fact an Urbana housing inspector. Dear Mr. Nichols, as a resident of West Urbana, I write, I appreciate the time that you take to keep up to date with inspection issues. I understand West Urbana is only a small part of Urbana, and your office is responsible for inspections of the entire city. It must be quite vexing to you then to have to deal with a single property, 707 West Illinois, time and time again. Mr. Nichols responds, thanks for your comments. There has been over-occupancy at this property even before I started working for the city in 1989. I do the best that I can. So indeed, there has been over-occupancy everywhere. Is there a problem with information? Well, I dispute that. In fact, the tenant union handbook is perfectly clear about the occupancy law, and it's perfectly clear about the consequences of over-occupancy. In fact, it states that largely the consequences are negative towards the tenant. Is there a privacy issue here? And indeed, I believe there could be, and Urbana is sensitive to privacy. But if I want mail delivered, I have to tell the post office where I live. In my area, if you want to park on the street, I have to, in fact, present to the city my residence. If I want a library card. If I want to go to the video store, even. So there are ways to protect the privacy issue, and there are already many instances that both federal, local, and even private agencies, in fact, require certification of where someone lives. There has been mentioned the issue of Urbana's and taxes. Well, I pay taxes also. In fact, data from the multiple listing service from summer 2003 to 2004 for some 30 homes sold in my area shows that if my home were transported from California 10 blocks to Vermont, it would increase in value by 42%. And the reason is largely because I'm surrounded by rentals, many of these rentals allowed to decay, and some of those rentals often over-occupied. Thank you for your time.
Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Dubevic, and I apologize for mangling your name.
Not an easy name.
Next, we have Gary Stebbins, representing the Weiner Companies of 1712 South Anderson.
Hi, I'm Gary Stebbins from the Weiner Companies. I'm their property manager, one of the realtors, certified appraiser, real estate broker, and half owner. And I had a prepared speech for you. I listened to other people, and I have more questions than things that I want to say. I did call community development when I read this ordinance, and my question to them was, how many complaints have you received? And according to them, for 2004, they received 7 complaints. Of those 7 complaints, only 4 were valid. Now, I don't know whether people in the neighborhood are just saying, well, we complain, and nothing happens, and so they don't complain anymore. But I guess my question is, if this is such a problem, why aren't there more complaints? And maybe there are a lot of complaints, but quite frankly, no one seems to know how many rental units are in the neighborhood. So that's my question. Is this, there's, by the way, the 4 real complaints, the 3 that weren't real were things like 2 cousins living together, new people coming, and there were 4 names on the mailbox, so they added their 4 names, so now you had 8 names on the mailbox. Being an appraiser and being in real estate, I look at things a certain way. And when someone says that the neighborhood is declining, then the first thing I look for is loss of value. And all I know is, from talking to Joanne Chester, from my own experiences and whatnot, is that that neighborhood has had appreciation even in the 80s, when other neighborhoods didn't, were flat or declining. So if we have a problem here, it doesn't seem to show. And maybe, and I'm in the neighborhood enough, maybe I need to get out of my car and walk the neighborhood. I also did a computer run with the Champaign County Association of Realtors, checking grid 56, which is most of West Urbana. And there was only 7 homes on the market. There were no homes in the 7, 6, and 500 block that I could perceive. There may be a for sale by owner, but I don't know anything about that. So there doesn't seem to be any panic selling. Only thing I can tell you is if you want to study this and you want somebody on a committee, I'd be very happy to be on this. Because, as I said, I had a prepared speech. I heard what other people had to say. I'm interested in helping. And by the way, we do have a financial interest in this. We manage 400 units. 10 houses are in West Urbana, but we have no intention of selling to anybody. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Just one. What do you do to make sure that your houses aren't overoccupied?
We make sure there's 4 names on the lease. Okay? We don't do any inspection. Well, it may sound funny, but we have 4 people sign. I mean, we don't. The only way that we start getting invasive in someone's life is if we get a complaint from the neighbor, the tenants complain about a maintenance problem, or the other thing is that they don't pay the rent. Then, with those 3 things, you'll get a visit from us. Other than that, you're left alone. We will, from time to time, do an inspection. It's once or twice a year, and that's about it. We tell everybody when we inspect. That's it. Any other questions?
Thank you. Mark J. Wetzel of 802 West Florida.
First, I want to thank the council persons for serving. It's not a thankful job sometimes, particularly the mayor and Esther who are leaving. I've looked to Esther for a lot of advice over the years, and I may not have agreed with her all the time, but I respect her for the position she took and for serving, and for the rest of you, too. I've been living at my address since about 1958. It's been my legal residence since that time. My spouse and I have owned the property since 1979, I believe. I worked with my father in part to manage property in mostly Champaign for about 30 years while growing up here. We never over-occupied the property to circumvent the ordinances at that time. I fully support the zoning ordinances as they are now in place, and, well, others did not. I'm opposed to the ordinance as currently proposed because it's selective to a certain part of the city, and I still have a bad taste in my mouth about the parking situation in my neighborhood. I think all should have to buy permits or none, but I understand that I have one voice in that matter. I would hate to see this ordinance be selected or put in place for only a certain part of the city. I'm not opposed to it in principle. I won't gain or lose financially one way or the other. I don't own rental property in the city at the moment, and I don't know if I ever will anymore. But I don't want to see this ordinance put in place for only a certain part of the city if it's going to go in place. Because over-occupancy probably occurs throughout the city regardless of what street it's east of or west of or north of or south of. I think if you go east of Vine Street or east of Philo, you will find over-occupancy as well. So I think if you're going to push this forward, first of all, make it across the board throughout the city. Secondly, establish what penalties you're going to put in place for this if people are caught violating it, after you've established how you're going to catch those violators, not only the landlords, but also the tenants. It's easy to have 2 names on a lease and 4 people living there, as easy it is to have 4 names on a lease and 2 people living there because they're somewhere else. So if you're going to consider this further, I think you ought to put in place what penalties will be presented to those violators and what you're going to do after you present the violation to them, and what recourse they have and what recourse the city has financially and otherwise. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. Glenn Berman, 611 West Washington.
I'd like to address you with 2 hats on tonight. First, I'd like to address you as a resident of the proposed rental registration zone. I've lived within a 2-block area for going on 30 years now, in my current residence for about 13 years. Previous speakers who don't live in the neighborhood have questioned how prevalent the issue of over-occupancy is. I know with absolute unequivocal certainty of 3 residences, single-family homes, within 1 block of my home that are currently over-occupied. I assume that my block and the 1-block radius I live in is no different than the 1-block radius on Illinois Street or High Street or any of the other streets in the area. If you ask any of the people in the audience tonight who live in the neighborhood, is there a problem with over-occupancy, in particular rental units, I think almost everyone would agree there is. I also don't see that developing this program for a particular area is out of character or unfair. Things in life aren't intended to be equal, they're intended to be fair. Just because we do one thing in one area of the city, we don't need to do it in every area of the city. And the city has done that for decades. Our TIF districts, our parking regulations, there's countless things that we implement around the city to address where there are particular overwhelming may be a bad word, significant problems that need to be addressed. And the issue of over-occupancy is significant in the West Urbana area. Does it exist in other areas of the city? Yes, it does. Should the program be citywide? Probably it should. Is it likely that it would get passed citywide at this point in time? No, it's not. So, but it is and would be helpful to the area of West Urbana. I now would like to put on my hat as a landlord that owns rental property in the proposed zone, single-family homes that would be impacted by this proposed ordinance. Do I think it's onerous? No. Do I think it's burdensome? No. Do I sit with my tenants and have them initial a special spot in their lease that's an affidavit that they know the ordinance, current ordinance and what's going on? Yes. Do I work for a company where I sit with many other individuals and go over leases, and those tenants take a 4-page lease and go through that lease in under 2 minutes and say, okay, I'm ready to sign? It happens every day. The affidavit is a good way to get that across. As a landlord, I think that the proposed ordinance levels the playing field for being in the landlord business. When a house is overoccupied, and landlords can realize greater revenues and at the same time charge less per person for rent. And when I talk with prospective renters, they are concerned with what is it going to cost me individually, and over-occupancy puts me at a competitive disadvantage in terms of my rent compared to those residences that are over-occupied. Additionally, I also want to buy more properties in the West Urbana area, and when properties are sold, the sale is often based upon a gross rent multiplier formula, and the gross rents that a landlord sells on when there's over-occupancy, I can't afford to buy at that price because I can't pay that price and then turn around and limit the occupancy to 4 and realize a return on my money. So if all of the single-family residences in that area are held to the no more than 4 unrelated, I see that as leveling the playing field for me in terms of what my rents are compared to other residences and my ability to buy other additional properties in the area. Thank you.
I'm sorry, one question. A number of people who live in the neighborhood have said they feel there's a large, or I won't say a large number, but a considerable number of properties that are overoccupied, and you've reemphasized that. To what do you attribute the relatively low number of complaints that the city's received recently? Have people given up? Do people not think the city's going to help them, or do people not know there's a problem, or don't feel comfortable?
People know that there's a problem and that the city did not have the tools to do anything about it. So there's no point in complaining because nothing would happen. And I think the recent change a few weeks back in the zoning ordinance and this proposed change will start to give some tools that would help start to solve that problem.
Thank you. Ellen Nudo, representing the Central Illinois Apartment Association, 1501 Interstate Drive.
Well, good evening, everyone. Mr. Mayor, council members. I want to reinforce some of the things that Sally said, Sally Eisfeld, who is with the Champaign, the Central Illinois Apartment Association. I'm past president for the last 2 years, and we stand ready to enforce, help you enforce those existing ordinances that evidently are not being enforced, and also to provide education. As further, I guess, proof is probably the word I'd like to use. In the last few years, we've reached out with Esther and the Tenants Union to involve her more in our activities. She has spoken to us. We have invited her to other meetings to come and visit with us. I personally have called her let's say a couple of times to clarify things, and one of which was last Friday, and we had a gentlewomanly conversation about this particular ordinance. And again, she mentioned in this meeting tonight and to me that there were several not board members, but there were several members in our organization who were violating. I took the liberty of calling those people and making them aware of what they may or may not be doing properly, to allow them to investigate it for themselves. And I think that's what Sally's talking about, that we can assist in this matter without adding another layer of bureaucracy, additional costs. I think Ms. Chenoweth's comment about the $10 and the $3 being a minimal cost, what needs to be weighed obviously is behind the desks of the offices that will have to enforce this and other costs that are involved with computer software and all the other things that are going to be involved. So before we take that step, what we're also recommending is putting together a committee that we can take a look at these things in a rational way and see how we can enforce these existing laws to prevent over-occupancy. I would make one comment, too, that we own a number of apartments that not in this city, but what we find that over-occupancy, more likely than not, is caused by the resident because of relationships, because of other issues, comings and goings, which the landlord has less control than you might think. Almost to the point where when we walk in the front door, there might be somebody leaving the back door. Okay? It's just very hard to get this enforcement. Now, for ourselves, we write in a guest clause in our leases where we only allow 14 days for a guest. And if they are in violation of the guest clause, we can evict on the basis of over-occupancy. That's one way that we might seek a solution here. It may be a longer or a shorter period of time, but we really sincerely want to work with you to make this thing work so that fines are meted out to those who violate. There was a little bit of laughter in the back about Mr. Stebbins' comment, a simple comment. Mr. Alex asked, how do you enforce it? And you get 4 leases signed. If this gentleman, Mr. Stebbins, is getting 4 leases, he's not doing it for profit motive. He's not getting any more than 4 leases rent. So those who are not in the know about apartment rentals, property management, it being a diversified way to build your net worth, some of the laughter really is not very, it isn't based on fact. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that it is a tough business, just like any other business we're in. I'm not complaining about it, but one other comment. I just have to make sure that Mr. Dubevic understands that I do teach at Urbana Adult Education. I do teach about owning rental property. I do not teach over-occupancy. And that was inferred there. Because profit is not a dirty word, and if you do get more profit, it doesn't mean you do it illegally. It doesn't mean that you are over-occupying. It is something that, again, all of us have the opportunity to build something for retirement. So I just, again, want to make sure that everybody understands we would be happy to serve on a committee. I am also on the Board of Realtors. Some of the comments made about perhaps getting the realtors involved, title companies involved, with making sure that the City of Urbana is made aware of rental properties. I think that's a wonderful idea. I'd be happy to promote that on the board with any way that you'd like to see me do it.
Thank you. Any questions? Ms. Chenoweth?
Quick question. It's understandable that any individual wants to self-enforce rather than be enforced because, and the issue is usually we see regulations happen when self-enforcement hasn't been working, and I think that's the situation that we have here.
Is it?
But I have a question about the cost.
Is it self-enforcement when everybody's admitted that the City of Urbana is not enforcing the rules? That's not self-enforcement. Well, evidently it's been, because the reason why we're layering on this additional law is because the existing laws haven't worked.
Well, tenants haven't self-enforced. Apartment or single-family unit owners haven't self-enforced. And the City of Urbana has been running around trying to enforce, but we haven't had the tools to do that, and we're trying to find the appropriate tools to be able to enforce. But my question is the issue of cost, because I'm actually quite confused by some of the comments today, because I feel like this is really a no-cost, in many ways, program. And the options that we had were, we looked at the $300 a year cost that West Lafayette has. We looked at the $200 a year cost, and we settled on what I consider to be just the absolute bare minimum cost. And so when you talk about these, then you talked about how there were the behind-the-desk costs, which I understand as a business owner myself, that staff costs something.
Sure.
So the question, though, is you're going to do the same things if you self-enforce than if you are compliant with the law. And so the same amount of paper gets pushed in some way. You're going to have either affidavits signed or whatever tools you choose to use. to comply with this law the same way you would if you were self-enforcing and actually being able to self-enforce adequately. And so I guess the question of behind-the-desk cost doesn't make sense to me, because it's simply the case that we have a problem that apartment owners or single-family home owners are going to have to do more work, no matter what, whether it's self-enforcement or code or compliance with Urbana's laws. And yet I continue to hear the case that this is going to be a cost issue. And I need to know what it is that we're asking you to do if we do pass this that's different from what you would be doing to actually successfully have compliance with Urbana's codes through self-enforcement. What are the different activities, and why is it what we're asking you to do is so much more than what you would be doing yourself anyway?
I am opposed to the additional layer of ordinances here. I'm opposed to the additional fines that would be added to this. A fine for over-occupancy, noise, parking, all of those we are definitely in favor of. We would work with our members, help to get it disseminated out any way you would ask us to do.
Just have one real quick question. Can you speak to, I think Mr. Berman made a good point about competitive disadvantage, the notion that if we're in a climate where the city, if you accept this argument, doesn't have the tools to enforce these ordinances, then it works to the benefit of landlords who are going to break the rules, and it works against landlords who are willing to abide by the rules because it restricts their profit and forces them to charge an increased rate amount of rent per tenant. Are you sympathetic to that argument?
Yes. Yes, I am. I think there are going to be some bad eggs in every bunch that we're talking about here, and I fully support anything you choose to do to those people who are circumventing the rules. And we would do anything we can from an education standpoint to make sure our property owners don't violate the law. And to the point where, again, where Ms. Pat made me aware of something, I immediately made those people aware of it, and they are investigating. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Chad Castle of 511 West California.
Hello, thank you. My name is Chad Castle, and I live at 511 West California. I lived in this neighborhood on West Illinois when I graduated from the University of Illinois in 1995. After that, I began purchasing homes in this area for rental property use, and now currently live in the neighborhood. Of my 6 rental properties in this particular area, actually only one is affected by this potential ordinance. But I would just like to state that how it's currently stated, I am in opposition to the ordinance. I think there are ordinances in place that just need to be enforced. I think that there's no doubt that there are over-occupancy, issues, whether it's single-family or owner-occupied. That's one thing that no one else has mentioned tonight. Living in the neighborhood, and I think there are probably people sitting up there, know that there are owner-occupied houses in this neighborhood that take in students. They fill their basements, they fill their attics, and I don't blame them because it's a couple $1,000s a month income that they're getting, like we've heard tonight. And so if this is going to come to fruition here, I'd like to see that it's not just single-family homes. Let's hit all single-family homes, whether they're owner-occupied or rental properties, because you'd probably find as many owner-occupieds as you would rental properties now. And the other thing is living in the neighborhood. I think it's a great neighborhood. The 10 years since I've graduated, I don't think that it's changed much. And quite honestly, as far as I've had one incident where I had a neighbor turn me in because they thought that my house, I was cramming students into it. It's a house that's zoned as a duplex, and I had 5 students living in a 5-bedroom house, and the neighbor just was not aware of that. As far as the awareness, we've heard about that. I think that Esther, and there are a lot of good things happening as far as awareness on over-occupancy. I mean, WUNA puts a flyer in everyone's mailbox letting them know what the occupancy ordinances are. I got one in my mailbox. I got one in, all my houses in that area. The word is out. I take a little bit of offense because I take all the money that I am able to make off the properties and put them back into them. I don't buy the nicest houses on the street. I typically buy the ones that need a little bit of work, and I put that back in. I have worked with the city. I've bought houses that were condemned in that area and had to, take out all the permits and redo the entire house, working inside out. But at the same time, there are as many rundown, owner-occupied houses on these streets. I'm not buying that either, And quite honestly, I feel targeted a little bit as a, landlord, even though I live in the neighborhood. I'm not sure, if we're, I'm not sure how it's going to be enforced, who's going to enforce this if it does pass. I'd be curious to know how that's going to change it all, how, signing an affidavit and having my tenant sign an affidavit, how the enforcement is going to change and how it currently works. Because I think if you have good landlords, bad landlords, just like you have, good and bad everything else, is that really going to weed out the bad landlords? I don't know. I think our neighborhood does a good job of keeping an eye, and I've learned that much more since I've moved to the neighborhood, keeping an eye on what's going on in the neighborhood and kind of policing itself. So I'm not necessarily, I'm just opposed to it in theory. I think, why not the entire city? Why not, every single house, whether they're owner-occupied or single-family? Even though I only have one house that's affected, I think, there are some good things, but I just think it needs to be thought through a little more. So, any questions for me, Esther?
Did you say you have a house that's zoned as a duplex that you rent as a 5?
Well, no. There are 5 people living in the house, 3 on one side, 2 on the other, and it's split. So my neighbor thought it was over-occupied when in fact it's not, because I can have 4, and this is the house that Clay came through, and I could ultimately have 8 unrelated parties living there, and I don't. But it's just and it's not. I don't. The neighbor's just looking out for the neighborhood, and they didn't realize that. But and I have a number of houses that are zoned or whatever like that. So.
But it is a legal duplex.
Correct. It is a legal
you
duplex.
Get from one housing unit to the other one without going outside.
Correct. So there's a main entrance, and then there's 2 outside. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Casey Diana, 401 West Vermont.
Hi, everyone. I'm Casey Diana. I've been a resident of Urbana Ward 4 for 12 years. First off, I'd like to state that I approve of the rental registration program. It's a wonderful breakthrough in protecting the quality of Urbana neighborhoods. However, I have a few concerns. While I know there has been some discussion about expanding the rental registration program to all of Urbana, the reasons for not doing so remain unclear. Simply, if there isn't any citywide problem in this regard, fine, nothing lost. But if there is, and I know of at least one house in Behringer Commons that reportedly rents out a basement apartment, although the area is strictly zoned single residence, an emerging problem could be nipped in the bud. I suggest, in an effort to avoid present and future over-occupancy problems in all of Urbana, that the proposed rental registration program for the West Urbana neighborhood be made into a citywide construct. Also, I suggest that those members of the City Council who own rental property themselves should recuse themselves from voting on rental issues entirely, in an effort to avoid concerns that might arise due to conflicts of interest. After all, if, as has been maintained, governing bodies cannot be expected to fairly monitor themselves, I'm referring here, of course, to the police department, how then can landlords be expected to pass unbiased rental ordinances? The proposed rental registration program also stipulates that, quote, owner-occupied homes renting out 2 or more or fewer rooms are additionally exempt. How could this possibly be monitored? What is to prevent each room from having 2 or more residents, with the corresponding number of cars? Frankly, I would like to know which members of the present City Council, and for that matter the newly elected City Council, are landlords themselves, and also whether it would be to their advantage not to make the rental registration program a citywide ordinance, and additionally, would they benefit financially from the proposed owner-occupant exemption? Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. Any questions?
Apparently not. Thank you. Kate Hunter of 510 West Oregon.
Good evening, everybody. A lot of my points have already been dealt with, so I'll try to shave some time off here. I would like to say that I admire the efforts of this local, the Central Illinois Apartment Association to try to control what's happening in their units. But first of all, not all landlords belong to this association or another one that might have similar motives. And thus, we wind up with compliance based on hope, on voluntary efforts, and so on. It's not a complete and fair system to do it that way. The registration program, it will be a trial, but I think we need to find out if this will work, perhaps starting with one part of the city to see if that is going to be effective would be the best way to approach it. In regard to complaints not being filed, I think this is true that people gave up. We're told it's impossible to make an inspection that would determine who's in there. I'd like to say that disseminating information at the point of purchase, in other words, at the time of the signing of the lease, this is the best way to go for everyone. The landlords become aware, if they were not aware, of what the law is, and people signing the leases, people planning to move into places, will know ahead of time instead of down the road when problems develop. If you already have people who have signed a lease, there's some reluctance to evict if it's simply left up to the landlord. The affidavit, the question was what would be the point of the affidavit? It's a legal document. Then when you do have a complaint, you have a legal document that proves that people were told what the law was at the time of the signing of the lease. That's my comments. Do you have any questions for me? Thank you.
Thank you. Susan Frobish of 809 West Delaware.
Hi, my name's Susan Frobish. I've been a resident in West Urbana for 19 years. I'm also a realtor, and I'm a landlord, although a small one. I only own 13 units in the neighborhood. I'm not opposed to the rental registration, as I believe the end result will provide more accountability and safer rentals. However, many of us in the neighborhood are aware it is a few very identifiable pieces of property that are continuous offenders. And I think I'm not opposed to it. Many of us comply. There's, like it's been said before me, a few bad apples in the bunch. And if this is what it's going to take to help prevent them from continuing what they're doing, then I'm for this. Much of what I had to say has been addressed. I wanted to point out an and address something that Gabe said earlier on. I don't think the efforts here are to keep students out. The goal here is to preserve a wonderful neighborhood filled with diversity that is safe and well-maintained. What this ordinance doesn't help us with is the issue of well-maintained properties. And it just takes a walk through the neighborhood, whether it's owner-occupied or landlord. There are properties that are not complying and are not well kept, and you can see extra names on the mailbox. And if this will help, you know, like I said, I'm for this. Let's see. You know, I think that, you know, in the West Urbana Association, you know, I think that, at least from my perspective, as a realtor, I'm in a lot of these houses. And some of these will break your heart. And I'm really happy to hear about the Apartment Association wanting to help with education. I mean, maybe we need more education. I was in a place today that I showed that sometimes you just can't believe someone's actually paying rent to live in such deplorable conditions. And maybe they just don't know any better. Maybe they don't know that that bad wiring is a code violation. Maybe they don't know that that basement bedroom has no egress window and that shouldn't be a bedroom. You know, there really needs to be, we say we have these things in place, but there needs to be a better effort. On the other side, you know, I'm proud to say I sold the Websters on California that house and just watched them transform a rundown rental into something beautiful and a showcase in the neighborhood. And it's still a rental, and they comply with the rules, and you know, so it can be well done. In my own experience, I've put a lot of money back into my properties. I've never had any trouble with over-occupancy. I've had students kind of say, this is too nice, we don't want to live here, this looks like my mother's house, you know. So I mean, and you know, it's that's kind of a funny reaction, but you know, on the other hand, when I get someone who does want to sign that lease with me, they appreciate the work that's been done. And I have no trouble having occupancy, you know, filling my capacity, and I have no trouble, you know, with vacancies, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And my rents are probably not the cheapest in the neighborhood either. I guess overall, you know, I wish there'd be a way that we can address, we do have some very specific problems in the neighborhood. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I lived on Illinois Street on the 600 block. There was a house on the corner, this kind of infamous, the green house, that it's a grandfathered duplex. There was always 8 people in it. It was never used as a duplex, and yet it seems to have slipped through the cracks. I don't know if it's still a problem since I moved a few blocks away 6 years ago. On the other hand, there was an elderly gentleman on the block who rented several rooms in his house. There was never a problem. He kept the property up, and was he overoccupied? Probably, but we didn't complain because the students were respectful. He kept the property up, and it wasn't a problem. So, you know, I think what we have is a goal to, starting with the occupancy, but then taking it to the next step of having safe, well-maintained properties in the neighborhood. And if students would realize they shouldn't be paying anybody any rent to live in some of these places, you know, maybe they would not rent from those people, and those people would sell their houses, and the people who are responsible landlords could buy them and fix them up. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, thank you. Seth Fine, 812 West Stoughton.
Hello, council humans. I don't have too much to say, except that it seems as though some of the people speaking may forget that it's hard to be a student and afford to be able to live in such a nice neighborhood. I don't know if any of you have ever lived on campus, like where the fraternities are and Joe's or whatever. It sucks to live there. If you want to talk about noise, check it out for a while. But I will say that as a resident of Urbana for 25 years, grew up on the south side, kind of always wanted to say that, and moved to the downtown area, I was always honored to be able to live down there. And the reason I was able to live down there is because I was over-occupying a house rented by somebody here. And I knew that it was against the law. That's true. Didn't bother me much because I don't understand to the day why it's only 4 people across the board, given the fact that houses are different sizes with multiple bedrooms and sometimes 2 kitchens, sometimes 3 refrigerators, sometimes 1 is in the backyard. That's true. And I'm not condoning that. But I think that what you're proposing is not going to help in the long run. I think it's just more paperwork and whatever it is that people do that are here, which I'm not that familiar with. But I will say that students are uninterested, generally speaking, with city government. They come down here from their neighborhoods up north and they occupy what they need to for the time that they're here. And if they can save $1 to buy some more beer, they will. I don't think that they're interested necessarily in obeying these rules. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not supposed to enforce them. If that's the rule in Urbana, by all means enforce it. Obviously, it was voted on, so you should enforce that rule. But this is not going to change anything. I lived in a house with 10 people in it, none of which were unrelated, were related, and we had a ball. It was uncomfortable at times, and the speaker right before me said that these conditions, maybe we didn't know the difference of what was good or bad living. We knew the difference, and I remember a moment where the ceiling, somebody in here may remember this, the ceiling caved in on me in my bedroom in the middle of the night. It was a delight to wake up to that kind of thunderous crash and my computer broken. Water all over my bedroom. My cat under the rubble probably should have died, but my cat's resilient. So there are bad conditions, and I think that you need to do whatever you can to enforce it, but I don't think that this is going to help. But let me say this, more than anything, is I'm more here, I don't know how to say this, I'm here on behalf of some other people who don't take the time to come to a city council meeting, who are a little freaked out by some of the organizations in the West Urbana neighborhood. Whatever it is that you do, find a way, please, as elected officials, to prevent some of the neighborhood people from the gross disregard for privacy in this neighborhood, and that there are reports, some of whom are very close to me, of residents spying on people in the neighborhood to try to figure out how many people are living here. How many people are living in this house? Well, let's look in the windows. How about we do that? It's a rational idea. Let's look in the windows and find out how many people are living in this house. In fact, we'll take pictures of the mailboxes and we'll post them online. Maybe that'll drive them out. UrbanaRepublic.info. You can check it out for yourself. There's pictures of this online. Yeah, he's laughing. It's kind of ridiculous. But there are people that have seen people looking into windows and going up on porches and looking how many people are living here, how many people are living there. And in one case, a female who, in a towel, not in her bedroom, that's true, she went to go get a snack from the kitchen. Hopefully there was one fridge in there, that's true. She sees a man up, looking up. Is that 3 people? Do they look the same? Do they have the same kind of nose? I don't know. No, come on. There's got to be a line that's drawn somewhere where you want to talk about privacy. What kind of town are we living in? And more importantly, where are the priorities of these people when there are children who don't get Christmas toys or Chrismukkah toys or, and you're worried about how many people are living in a home? Yeah, we all have valid concerns in, our day-to-day lives, and we all want our neighborhood to look nice, and I think that the landlords of these properties should be held accountable for property looking disheveled and, they should be. But there's got to be a way to get our priorities straight. And I'm speaking to you guys as the microphone's pointed this way, but some of the people that I'm speaking to are behind me. Get your priorities straight, stop spying on people, and consider what you're doing with your life day to day. Because one person extra in a house is not going to bring anyone's child home from Iraq, and is not going to, feed any starving people, and it's certainly not going to make you rest better at night. And if you think that it is, you've lost it. So do something to stop this. Because I've got some pretty frightened friends living in West Urbana, which, by the way, I'm proud to say that I live in and love living in. And for the record, my house is in compliance. Thank you. Any questions?
I have a question.
Ms. Pat?
Every year, I see students get in the shaft because they are for what you're complaining about. There are, whether you like it or not, whether I like it or not, there are a lot of people who want the law enforced. And what happens in each and every case that I'm familiar with is that the city finds out there are more than 4 people in the house, and the students, who are everyone, whatever number over 4, the extra, have to move out. And they had no idea that the law existed before they rented the house.
Yeah.
And in recent years, most often, the problem has been that the landlord chumped them into putting 4 names on the lease.
Landlords tend to do that.
Yes, I know. I work at the tenant union, believe me.
Oh, I've come to see you before. You saved me once. Thank you.
Well,
Well, I don't know if you saved me, but you gave me the proper... Right, because he was being mean to me.
Well, what I'm trying to do here is help people, save people from getting into this,
I know you do, Esther.
cycle year after year after year. So what I'm asking you is, I think that this could reduce the need for, the circumstances that might cause people to peek in people's windows, because instead the city would require the property owner to report to the city what they're doing. But I guess what I want to ask you is, do you think it is frivolous for us to try to stop the situation where students pay the price for the landlord's deception and renting houses to more people than they're supposed to?
I don't know if it's frivolous. I think that's a bigger word than necessary. Not to call you pretentious. That's what I'm trying to say. Not that I know what that means. I guess what I'm saying is I don't think that it's an invalid concern for you to try to enforce these things, but I guess I am trying to say is I don't know if this is the proper avenue to take. I don't know. I don't think that we'll know until you pass it and we enforce it, or you enforce it and you write the thing and the people pay the money, and when people start talking to you more. But I think that it's obviously I think that all I know is that it's obviously an issue, okay? And I don't see this particular solution. I don't see it changing the ability. It would be very easy for me to have somebody living in my basement right now. My landlord lives in Highland Park. Good luck. He'll get a P.O. box. Sorry, kids, you're not going to win, That's my point, is that I don't think that this is going to solve the problem necessarily. I do think that, and maybe this is going way out on a limb here, but maybe, I think, my mom actually works in this office, I think, the assessor's office. They assess the properties, right? I can't believe, right. Maybe each house, Tom, stop me if I'm going too far here. Maybe each house, I knew that was coming. maybe each house should be designated. How many people can live here? You know, because it's a broad generalization, because I lived at 404 Elm, and anyone who's familiar with West Urbana should know about 404 Elm, because we threw the best parties. And the bottom line is that there were room for 10 of us. Granted, there was 2 people living in an attic upstairs, but it was a huge bedroom. And you know, but there was plenty of space for dudes who don't really care about space. You know, I mean, so maybe 10 is excessive, that's true, but there's definitely room for 7 people in that house. And the, can I say who rents it?
Yeah.
Weiner Corporation, who were very nice to me despite their, right? They modeled it so 7 people could live there. And it's true, 4 of us were on the lease, and I was not, thank God, because I didn't get anything back. But, maybe each house deserves, as its own property and its own house, maybe each house deserves its own limitations. You know, I don't think that there should be 8 people crammed in a house. I think I remember a couple years ago, it was like 23 people living in a house in Urbana or Champaign or something. That's ridiculous. That's true. I'm opposed to that. I'll say it. But 4 unrelated people, I think it's pretty obvious that WUNA is less interested in, I think they're interested in preserving the neighborhood, that's true, and I am too. But I think that they're more interested in enforcing a law that says, stay out of our neighborhood, you crazy kids. How can you invade us like this? Well, you know, you can walk to class from there. They don't have to live next to Joe and Bob from Phi Delta Trelta or whatever, you know?
Can I ask you another question?
Yes.
All right, you lived in a house that had 4 names on the lease. You said you had 10 people, but it was set up for 7. In what way was it set up for 7?
Okay. I'm going by the Seth Fine Code of Standards. I don't know if that is in compliance, but if you think about the attic of a house, 2. Could have even done 3, because it's a big attic and really well redesigned. Very nice. 2. Down on the upper floor, below that, 1, 2, 3 bedrooms. Below that, 2 bedrooms. So that's...
So you're saying there are 7 bedrooms?
There's living space for 7 human beings, without question. And, you know, when we were only 7 of us there, it was really quiet, you know? There's, like, plenty of space to move around, and, you know, nobody was... we had the sweetest old couple living next door to us, and she baked us brownies. She baked us brownies, and we were over occupancy, and we'd have huge parties. I didn't really organize them that much, but huge parties, and every time we'd go to our neighbors and say, hey, listen, we're gonna have some friends over tonight, as to the number of friends, but, you know, they never complained, and neither did Welch across the street, or the people behind us, you know, and, you know, I realize that everyone needs their certain amount of volume level, but, you know, it's a student neighborhood and kids will be kids. But back to your question, you know, like, there's houses in Urbana, they're enormous, they're mansions, baby. And they should be zoned, I think, I don't know what you call it, it should be taken into account that more than 4 unrelated people could very well live in this house. I think that putting such a broad generalization on how many people live in this house is unfair to the integrity of the neighborhood. And I don't know how much work that would take. Probably there's better ways to spend our tax dollars. But I do know that disallowing more than 4 people per house is a little unfair, I think, especially when you're a student like I was, who had to work his way through college, you know, and I know that's a pity me case. That's all I want to say.
I'm going to cut you off here unless you have any more questions, just because we have so many people who want to speak.
That's fine. I'm just saying, do something
to
stop the spying. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave Joncic, 705 West Illinois.
I have to say this is going to be a very hard act to follow. But I'll do my best. I have something to hand out to the council here just for their records, if they would like to make notes. I think my son knows that fine. Kind of a local celebrity. He calls the wooden people Nutter Butters. I wasn't sure what that meant in your house.
That's my favorite cookie, man.
Okay. Well, let me give you another slant on this. I have lived in Urbana since 1968, a homeowner since 1976. I live on the 700 block of West Illinois Street. I've lived there for the entire time, and I have seen very slowly over the years my neighborhood turn into a slum. Now, maybe Seth doesn't agree with that. You know, I don't want to get into name calling here, but I have several people who have already testified that I could talk to about what they've said. When I moved into that neighborhood, it was residential. And you guys changed the names. You call it R1, you call it R2, you call it whatever. And you did downtown to campus, and you did all these rezoning things. The fact of the matter is, when I moved in there, one of the speakers previously now owns a rooming house on my block. When I was there in 1976, there were bicycles. Okay? Now, that rooming house is legal for 10 people, and there's 10 cars in the backyard. Next door to me is single family, for unrelated. I don't care what Seth says, that's the rule. The landlord bought that property knowing full well it was advertised with 5 bedrooms. Esther knows this because people would go to the tenants union and ask about renting that place. There have been 6 or 5 people in there since 1985. So I'm looking at more cars. So here I am thinking I'm buying into a residential neighborhood, and what I look at now is a used car lot out my windows. And you can say, okay, that's, you know, maybe Seth can say, well, that's fine. You know, kids have to have cars. That's not what I signed up for when I bought in Urbana. And it's getting worse. And I call every year, and the enforcement is so bad that nothing happens. So I stopped. But now that there's a penalty on the landlords, I'm going to start calling some more. All right, so looking at my notes here, I want to make the case that this is not a West Urbana issue. I know 3 of you on the or 3 of you sitting at this table here, maybe more, own property that rent. But I want you to try to be objective. I'm not trying to say all landlords are irresponsible. I'm not trying to say all students are irresponsible. I am a member of WUNA, but I have nothing against the students. And I would say of the people that I've seen on the WUNA list, I know 1/3 of them. And they have nothing against students. This is not an issue of the residents against the students. Like Oklahoma, the farmers and the ranchers can be friends. It's not that. This is an issue of residents trying to maintain a neighborhood compared to people who are trying to make money by buying homes in that same neighborhood and renting them. So if you look at my list here, the reason I think this is of citywide importance is it affects the property tax you collect. If you look at the first segment there, the WUNA study, which was done by one of the members here in the audience, looked at the sales price of 30 properties over the last couple of years from Greene down to Florida. Well, it was in West Urbana. And there was a 43% difference depending on how far south you moved that house. So what does that mean? If I own a home on Illinois Street and I move it, just take the home, I move it down to Vermont, it's worth 43% more. I'm the same distance from campus. It's not fair. It's not right. It's not what I bought. So I went to the county assessor, and I got data from 396 properties, of which I'm talking about 218 single-family properties compared to, or single-family owner-occupied properties compared to single-family rental properties. So there's 218 owner-occupied, 77 rentals in an area bounded by the race to Busey and Haida, Washington there, as I've discussed. You are losing tax money because you're letting these properties go down. You are not enforcing the law. And if Seth wants to live there with 12 people, that's fine, but go someplace else, because I don't think that that's what Urbana really wants to have. You are losing property tax revenue because the value of these properties is less. The difference between my study and the study that WUNA did is WUNA went farther south to Florida. So I will tell you, if you move my house from Illinois to Vermont, it will increase at least 50%. So is that what you want? You want to have, what I'm talking about is an equity in who pays property tax for what? The house next door to mine, now I have some case studies here. I live at 705, and so I'm using that as a benchmark. According to Joanne, my house, the assessed value is, well, I forgot my glasses, it's 45 something. All right, if you look on the other side of me, it's identical house. Hip roof, okay, 2-story, same thing. Look at the difference in assessed value. If you go to 711 West Illinois, which someone in this room right here owns, look at the value of that. That house is legal as a boarding house, a grandfathered boarding house, for 10 people. Is that what you want? You want to have a house that's got 10 people. I mean, you don't live there, so you don't have to look at the cars. But you're representing Urbana, right?
Are you asking me personally? Yes, I represent Urbana.
All right. So if you had a house that was the same size as mine, that gave you less property tax and degraded the neighborhood, would you like that?
Is that a rhetorical question?
No, I don't think so.
I think obviously we want to maintain the best quality properties in Urbana we can,
and that's
provide the best tax base.
And you know, this thing about WUNA is I was the one that put the billboard up about overhaul City Hall. And I was the one that Seth Fine was talking about WUNA and Nutter Butters. But well, I'll let it go. So anyway, if you look down this list there, you can see that there are different properties very close to mine, because those are the ones I'm most familiar with, and you can see the difference in assessed valuation. So I live in a place where Seth may think this is fine. Bands start practicing at 1:30 in the morning. And the property values are less than what they should be. And so overall, when you say WUNA is anti-student or anti-progressive, to me, even though I don't speak for WUNA, that's not true. I was a student, some of my best friends are students, and the fact is, it's the landlords that cause the problems, the owners, not all, but some, that leads to these problems. And you as a taxing body are losing revenue because of that. Any questions?
Thank you. Derek Bashir of 1609 Lexington Drive.
Evening, thanks for listening. I'm opposed for the same reason that the Apartment Association representative, basically most of her reasons, the selective enforcement, the increased bureaucracy, and other than educating, I don't believe it's going to really have the effect that everyone who's supporting this hopes. But I would say of the 42 violations that were claimed some 20 years ago, and we're down to 7 as of last year, it sounds like we're on the road to progress, and I don't really see a reason to change progress. So I'd say the problem is fixing itself at this point. There's 2 items that always go up and never go down: age and taxes. And I believe this opens the door to raising taxes. It starts at $13, which sure, that's not going to really hurt my bottom dollar. But then we heard $150 and then $300, and where's it going to stop on down the road 10 years from now? So I believe it opens up the door for more government, more local government, and that's not something that I'd like to see as a resident. I do own a property that's underoccupied in that area, and it appraised for $360,000 as opposed to the owner-occupied house next door, which is maybe worth $150,000 due to its condition, and it's in a great location. So I don't believe this is a landlord versus the owner-occupied in the area. I think it should be based on individual. The ordinance should be such. First of all, I don't think we should have the ordinance. I think we should enforce the ordinance that are already there based on an individual basis. And I guess that's it. I think all the other points are covered. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Melissa Brashear, for also 1609 Lexington Drive. Did you wish to speak or just register your support?
I was speaking for. Thanks.
Thank you. Kevin Hunsinger, 2004 Linview Avenue.
I'm Kevin Hunsinger, and I'm an owner of rental property in that neighborhood since 1978, and I'm coming in opposition to it as well. Quite frankly, the subjective part that I don't like is I really do think that you're now crossing the line from enforcement to management. There's a brand new rule out there that you've put in place to put penalties on landlords who don't do their job. They're stiff, and we really haven't given them an opportunity to work. And for some reason, we're now wanting to add a level on top. And it's not a money issue, it's a paperwork issue. And it's a continuous me trying to satisfy you that I'm doing my job. In the student market, I get lots of groups of kids who come from overseas. And they show up with multiple people who are related. And so now I'm going to have to continuously try to update you that, yes, there are 5 or yes, there are 6, but they're related. I have sublets that happen on a regular basis because someone leaves schools, or I could go on and on. So you can see it's not just a one-time thing, it's a continuous thing that will actually make me continuously talk to you every day or every multiple few months. And we're asking to do that when we haven't even checked out to see if this new law or ordinance that we put in place will work. Now, if you were coming to us 6 months from now or a year from now and said, this by itself doesn't work, does not work, I would at least entertain it. I think it really, the other thing that I see is the concern continuously is for unrelated is going to somehow reduce the occupancy in that part of town. And quite frankly, I don't think that's going to happen. And the reason is because it's simple supply and demand. Our University of Illinois is built right up to Lincoln Avenue, and there is going to be a set number of students who want to live within walking range, no matter what. So one way or the other, they're going to do that. And I was never concerned when Melrose and University Commons was built. I was never worried that I would ever suffer from their being built because there is a finite, every year, certain number of people who want to live 3 blocks from campus. And that number is historically, in my 27 years, it doesn't change much because our university brings in the same number of students every year. And so percentage-wise, the same numbers say, I don't care my living conditions, I want to walk to school. So I don't think this ordinance resolves that. It's just going to redistribute the problem. If the objective is to try to lower overall density for that neighborhood. You asked the question, why does the overoccupancy exist? And quite frankly, part of it is affordable housing. We have these larger homes that I would also agree could support more than 4 people. Legally, safely, from every standpoint, they could be acceptable housing. But, so what happens is a person rents it, and take the example, you rent it for $1,200 to 4 people, and there's 6 bedrooms in it. The monetary incentive to these students to sign that affidavit and still bring in 2 people to cut their rent from about $300 a month to maybe $200 a month is so great, they're going to do it. They're going to do it. So, I just really don't feel that this level of paperwork is going to solve the problem. And I guess that's all I have to say.
Any questions? Ms. Pat?
Thank you. On your website and in your brochures, you advertise 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10-bedroom houses.
That is correct.
And quite a few of those are legal rooming houses, but there are a few of these in the way of 5 and 6-bedroom that can only be occupied legally by 4 unrelated people. What do you do when you're leasing these houses? What do you do to communicate to your tenants that they cannot have more than 4 people and that they'll be breaking the law if they do?
I actually only have one property that is not legally, if I advertise as 5, it is not a rooming house or a duplex with 2 entrances such that it's actually in compliance. With the house that I have 6 bedrooms and only 4 can be there, again, I quite frankly just tell them what the rule is. I tell them to talk to you before they sign a lease. Quite honestly, I tell everyone to talk to you before they sign a lease. So they're going to have 2 levels. One, I tell them, and secondly, I tell them to see you. And after that point, quite frankly, it's out of my hands. And people laughed about that comment, but quite frankly, there is a line that I cannot cross as a landlord. I cannot cross. And I know for a fact as well because I witnessed it, a resident looking in the windows of an apartment, okay? It's crossing the line, but quite frankly, am I any different if I'm over there monitoring that on a regular basis? I think I am. I think I'm doing the exact same thing. So if I've told them, I've sent them to you to get a guidance, and I sign 4 people up, I think my responsibility ends.
Do you think it would be just a horrendous burden if you had to have them sign, at the time they're signed, at least sign another piece of paper saying that you told them that they couldn't have more than 4 people?
Is it horrendous for one unit? No. Is a big hassle when you have lots of them and there's continuous traffic and I have to probably send additional documentation when I've got more than 4 unrelated with some type of relationship that allows them? See, that's where I think it gets tough, is I've got cousins. And I'm going to send 2 sets of names to you, and then I've got to send, I'm not sure what, but something else to try to prove that they're related, even though their names don't match.
Just a statement that they're cousins, that's all you have to do, is they'd have to write that down on there.
That's all.
it. Yeah.
Does that not, I mean, if it's nothing more than that, doesn't it make it somewhat worthless? Because of the
Would you think it
monetary...
worthless if it would stop all the landlords who show the house to 6 people and say, hey, you can have 6 here, but we're only going to put 4 names on the lease because that's the law in Urbana, and then the students sign for it? If it would stop that, do you think that would be worthless?
Restate the question. I was thinking about something else simultaneously.
If this stopped the situations which do occur every year where landlords advertise a 6-bedroom house, have people respond wanting to put 6 people in it, and the landlord tells them, you can have whoever you want living here, but the law in Urbana is we can only put 4 names on the lease, and the tenants say okay and pay 6 people rent and put only 4 names on the lease. That's what we're trying to stop. If this stopped that, would you say it was worthless?
You know, I quite frankly, yes, I would say yes, but I again preface it with this, that they're not foolish, and they will recognize, I got 2 other nice big bedrooms here, I'm going to sign this, I'll sign the affidavit, but they're going to send 2 people anyway because they just saved themselves $150 a month. That's why I don't think, I understand the principle, and the principle's fine with me. But I always ask, what's going to happen in practice? And the monetary thing is not just on my side of it, it's on their side of it. Because this place that you asked me about, 6 people, I've now rented for next year for 4 people. And they know full well they can only have 4 people. But quite frankly, how do I know that at a monetary incentive, $150 a month, that they're not going to do something anyway? So, quite frankly, in that case, that's where everybody laughed when he said we should make every house its own size. Quite frankly, I think certificate of occupancies at varying levels isn't a bad idea. You actually may have better control, because at that point they all become like rooming house, and you do the systematic inspection of all of them, and you have better control. But
You would support systematic inspection of single-family homes?
Sure. You inspect everything else I have? Why not? And quite frankly, I know I'll probably get, now, these guys are probably like all over me about that, but I'm just one landlord, so I don't speak for anybody else in saying that, but I just don't have anything to hide, so, and you inspect all but 3 of my properties anyway in the last 9 months. Quite frankly, I think the whole issue is this over-occupance thing is secondary to having good condition properties. I just don't, that's what makes me wonder if it's really to correct over-occupancy or it's really to thin the neighborhood. Because I really think safe housing can be in numbers greater than 4.
Any more questions, Mr. Roberts?
If the city determined house by house how many people conveniently or comfortably could live in the home, what do you think it would take, or how likely would it be, do you think, that property owners would be interested in perhaps finishing an attic and adding 3 more bedrooms to make the occupancy level, raised by 3 individuals?
Well, see, I don't think you can, I think you can put an attic and justify 1 person, but I think you could easily, just by the same rules we use for rooming houses, say, there's no way you can put 3 up there. You got to have X number of square feet per bedroom. You got to have egresses. You get over a certain number, you got to worry about fire doors. I mean, there's all those things already in place.
Well, it would possibly then be true then that some houses that might have 5 bedrooms may not have 5 safe bedrooms because of egress problems or square footage of the bedroom or something.
Sure. But again, I have no problem with, why shouldn't they follow the same safety rules?
You're saying that
As multifamily.
if that was applied evenly and fairly to each situation, whether a landlord might be reduced a number of occupancy due to safety regulations, there should be a fair and equitable decision, which a landlord could face potentially.
If there was true trade-offs for housing that could support well more than 4, as well as trade-offs the other way, I think it would be overall safer. And you could still handle the amount of supply out there. Quite frankly, also, I think that, I hear a lot about how bad condition certain rental properties are in. Quite frankly, I think this goes outside this, but I do think sometimes that some of the things that are imposed on some of those landlords prevent some of them from not keeping things up as well as they would otherwise. That's not always the case. I know, unfortunately, I think we're really here for a couple people. That's the other thing that bothers me. We got 7 complaints. Half of them are probably the same 2 people. I think the rules that you just gave for new fines, that since they're multiple offenders, they could have $1,000 fines. That's going to curb them. And the rest of us who are in compliance won't have to be shuffling paper all the time.
Okay.
Any other questions? Thank you. We have one more person to hear from, John Dickel at 1005 South Busey.
I'm John Dickel. I've been a homeowner of a single-family home for 40 years now. 6 of those years I've been an absentee landlord because we've been away on sabbaticals or whatever, generally renting to students, once to a family. I would welcome this ordinance. I think that registering would have been helpful to us and our tenants at the time. I didn't know the rules, frankly. We just, some kids came in and said, yeah, you're going away, we want to rent the house. And we said, great. And I think it would have been helpful to us and them if we had had this ordinance, so that I support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Well, we've reached the end of the public comment, or those who have said that they wish to speak. I think at this point we should probably take a break, and after we return, Ms. Petal. Again, we are on agenda item now 5, discussion of single-family rental housing registration program from the February 14th committee meeting. And at this point, I'd like to ask Ms. Pat to present where this proposal is.
Thank you. First, I just wanted to present 2 more pieces of public comment, folks who couldn't be here tonight. Trent Shepard, who lives on West Oregon, I think it's 409, he didn't put his address on here, and owns rental property in the neighborhood, and he wrote in support of the program. And Peggy Patton, a homeowner at 609 West Indiana, who also wrote in support of the program. Give those to Ms. Clark. Okay. I'll try to do this quickly, but not so quickly that you don't I won't talk too fast. The first feature of this is that there is an area designated as the rental registration zone, and this would be an area bounded by University Avenue on the north, Florida Avenue on the south, and Vine Street on the east, and the city limits White Street on the west. And you heard testimony tonight about how much some people don't like that, but that was in response to concerns from council members that this that they did not want it to be citywide. Exempted from the requirements to register and file affidavits would be any homes that are rented for a period of less than 12 continuous months, such as sabbatical homes, and owner-occupied homes renting out 2 or fewer rooms. This would require that every owner of single-family residential rental property, other than those that were exempt, located in the zone, file with the city, or register with the city, a one-time registration, as we discussed 2 weeks ago. A one-time charge of $10 would be charged for that registration. Additionally, every rental property owner would be required to update his or her registration at no additional fee. If any new property is acquired, if there's any change in the address or phone number of the owner, the manager changes, or if the address or telephone number of the manager were to change. Each time a house is leased among those houses that are covered by this property, the owner would need to file with the city a sworn affidavit signed by the owner stating the total number of unrelated persons who will be occupying the house and attesting to the fact that the owner provided the tenants, prior to negotiating the lease, information about the zoning restrictions on the number of unrelated persons who could occupy the house, and a sworn affidavit signed by the tenants at the time of entering into the lease that they have been so informed of the four-person limit. And the language in response to concern raised by a couple of council members about addresses, using this address if they don't live there, the language says, any person who uses the address of the house for any purpose shall be considered an occupant unless he or she can prove residence at another location. Also, on these affidavits, in response to concerns raised by council members, the program description now says that tenant relationships only need to be identified on the affidavit form if the number of tenants other than children exceeds 4, in which case relationships need to be identified to the extent necessary to establish that not more than 4 tenants are unrelated. So, for example, if a couple, whether married or not, rented out one room, or if someone rented a house to 3 people, there would be no reason to put their relationship. If a house were rented to 4 adults, there would be no reason to put relationship. Only if the number of persons exceeded 4, then there would have to be information on the affidavit explaining why, or explaining the relationships of the number of people to bring down the number of unexplained people, presumably unrelated to 4. And there would be a $3 fee charged for each affidavit that is filed. So the owner of one house would have to pay $10 once, and if the house were leased annually, each year would have to pay $3. The proposal goes on to say the city will maintain a database of the registered properties, and the database will be available to the public and available online, and that database will have the information about property ownership. In the interest of tenants' privacy, the affidavits will not be available and will be exempt under the Freedom of Information Act, and that information about tenants will not be disclosed by the city except by court order or if used by the city to prosecute violators. Any advertisement, any written advertisement, sign, or any other representation of a single-family house will state the maximum number of unrelated persons allowed by law to occupy the dwelling. And I'll pause here and say I think that may be the most important part of this whole provision is to require that in the advertising. And then we have the penalties, which were slightly changed from what you saw before, but there is language here saying that if a first offense of failure to register a property this was a point I think Mr. Alex raised last week, obviously would carry with it a failure to file an affidavit because the affidavit wasn't filed since the property wasn't registered, and so those would not be treated as 2 offenses. The first offense would be treated as just one offense, and there would be the initial fine of $100.
We are going about it
on a second offense, the fine goes up to $250, and in that case, if a property owner
is that nobody
with a second offense of not registering, as well as a second offense of not filing an affidavit,
therefore it's
could be double charged.
to criticize.
Although once they're registered, that's not likely.
That is not what has made this country.
I'm sorry, could I ask you to pause here while
The of this country lies in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and the freedom of speech and thought.
Okay. We seem to have another program competing with the council here, according to the speaker.
Sounds like film noir or something.
It's probably the program that was
The Bill
scheduled
of
at 10 o'clock.
Rights.
The Bill of Rights, I heard that, yeah. do you want to?
Are they in the weeks leading up to the one?
We're implying that there are only 7 overoccupied homes. I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but I can off the top of my head name 15 homes that are within 2 blocks of my house, 3 blocks of my house, that are overoccupied right now. And that is why I brought this proposal forward, because there is growing demand from the people in my neighborhood that the city enforce this law. And the city does enforce. People say we haven't been enforcing. We enforce in response to complaint, but it is tiresome for people to keep complaining about the same property. The city carries out the enforcement, kicks the extra people out, and the next year it just gets rented out again to a larger number of people than is allowed by law. And my frustration is seeing this. I work at the tenant union. I see this from both ends. It's so obvious to me why this is happening, and we have this over occupancy because a large number of property owners are marketing these houses to larger numbers of people than the law allows to live in them. And just even the one thing, when the student sees an ad in the paper that says 6-bedroom house, that means 6 people. And if the ad said 6-bedroom house, no more than 4 unrelated persons, that would make a difference to a lot of people. And maybe not folks like Seth Fine, who represented to you a perspective that some students have of violating the law. Mr. Fine, I do not think is typical of all students. I certainly know that, and I was just telling Kevin Hunsinger in the back of the room during our break, in the last year, in my office at the tenant union, we've turned away at least 20, or talked to at least 20 groups out of renting overoccupied homes. What saddens me is those houses end up getting rented anyway, so somebody else who didn't get the consumer information ended up getting chumped into it. And I would very much like to see that this cycle of the law being violated stopped, because the people who are paying the price for the violation are the consumers, and the people who are not are the property owners.
If I understand the procedure correctly, this is a discussion item from the previous committee meeting, so we're in a discussion phase at this point. So I think we can recognize anyone who wants to make a comment.
Okay.
Chenoweth?
Yeah, I have a question actually for our attorney, and then a couple of comments. The question for Mr. Holtz is, and I believe I was told you were looking into this, so was the issue of the FOIA, can we legally exempt affidavits with tenants from the Freedom of Information Act?
I think that there's a couple of issues about privacy, but really with the FOIA, it's not a matter of whether we can exempt it, but whether the FOIA exempts it itself. Now, the FOIA has provisions in there that exempt information that would lead to unduly or unwarranted invasion of privacy. And I think that information would fit into here. I hesitate to say that I think it's a good idea to request this type of affidavit information. And there's at least one case out there that suggests it's not a good idea for the government itself to to ask for this kind of information from tenants. So, but there's nothing that I found that clearly says it's improper to do it in the first place.
Okay. I have just two comments then. One is, I notice a difference between the program design and the two forms, the affidavit and occupant confirmation. Actually, it's the occupant confirmation, which says, I understand that a person who uses this address for any purpose shall be considered an occupant. And in the design, it says, uses this address for any purpose shall be considered an occupant unless he or she can prove residence elsewhere. I think those two should be consistent, and it should say unless he or she can prove residence elsewhere.
Well, yeah, and that particular provision, and we're getting into another level of detail here, but that particular provision gives me serious pause because it's worded so broadly that it that it arguably applies to anybody who's a visitor. Anybody who uses the address is going to be presumed to be an occupant unless they can prove otherwise. Well, what does using an address mean? If you go and visit a friend there, then are you presumed to be an occupant to that property?
Well, if the police stop you and ask you where are you located, where are you staying, and you say, 412 West Illinois, which is my address, that would be using the address. I actually thought originally it said uses this address to receive mail, and it changed this time, but I mean, we're trying to get at something. I think we all understand what we're trying to get at. The question is what the appropriate language is.
Yeah, well, and it's something that we would need to work on. I just want you to know up front at this point that I think the way it's phrased right now there really could cause us some grief that we don't want to have. People need to be able to have guests for a certain amount of time, and I don't know whether and what's the appropriate amount of time, but overnight guests. One landlord here suggested that he was using some kind of a standard of 14 days. We'll run into some serious problems if we start telling people that they've got to prove that they don't live at a property if they're there visiting. Somebody has their mother over for good. Well, of course, and that's been there related. Somebody has friends over from out of town or undergrad friends or whatever. That can become a problem. But those are the kinds of things we can work through. I don't really have that much of a concern. Going back to the FOIA question, just real briefly, I want to make sure that I'm clear on how I answer it. The FOIA is basically self-implementing, and there's really nothing that we can do as a community to change its meaning. It preempts home rule, so what FOIA says is what it says, and we can't change it. And we can't create new categories of exemptions. So, the language as it's proposed here in this material says that we're declaring that this affidavit information is exempt from FOIA. Well, we can declare anything we want, but that doesn't mean we have any effect in doing so. And if we have the information, and if someone were to request it be disclosed, we would. My assumption would be that whoever the administration is at the time would take the position that that information is not disclosable under the Freedom of Information Act. But if someone were then to challenge that determination, then it would ultimately, or could ultimately, be a court that makes a determination. So then we're sitting there as a government with this load of private information about people, and we could very well be ordered to disclose it because a court could say, well, as a court, we don't think that it's exempt from disclosure, and you have to disclose it. I think that's unlikely, but it does remain a possibility. I think that pretty much answers the question. Ms. Pat, you look like you've got a...
No, I'm just wondering what load of private information you're talking about. The address at which a person lives is the private information that's contained in these affidavits.
The affidavit and the as I read the proposal, it says you don't have to disclose relationships, but you do if there's more than 4 people living there, and then you do have to disclose relationships. And it's that kind of thing that then becomes kind of touchy.
Can I make my final comment?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to finish out my comments, and these are comments that I reviewed with Glenn Berman on the phone, and I actually wasn't well enough today to convey this to Ms. Patton, so I apologize for that. But the last comment is just that Wherever it says unrelated persons in the affidavits, I think it might be convenient for us to put parentheses that say not by blood or domestic partnership. And if we feel like we need to refer to a specific definition, we can then put in fine print, at the bottom, see section X, Y, and Z of the ordinance. The only reason I say that is because in our current legal system, people who are same-sex partners who have lived together for 18 years and have 3 children and 8 grandchildren are usually have found themselves to be considered unrelated legally in every other context. And so by saying by blood or domestic partnership, it just conveys that we actually, in our ordinance, consider relationship a little bit differently than people are used to, than particularly same-sex couples who aren't legally allowed to marry in the state. So by doing that, it doesn't add a whole bunch of words, but it does convey that. Those are all my comments.
Ms. Pat, sorry.
Thank you. Ms. Chenoweth, if we use the same language that would be the language for the text amendment to the zoning ordinance, which would be blood, marriage, domestic partnership, and then whatever language we're going to have to include adoption and foster children, if that were the language in here, would that?
That's fine.
That's
I just want clarification of what that means so that people understand specifically, since relationship isn't always clear.
And on the subject of the address, you were the one who brought up the concern about people using the address for receiving mail. If this were to say, any person who uses the address of the house to receive mail shall be considered an occupant unless he or she can prove residence at another location, would that satisfy the concerns about that?
If somebody is in prison, they actually can show that they have residence elsewhere. If somebody is traveling, they could get a P.O. box. There are ways to get around it. So just some of the particular situations I was thinking of, if you can prove residence elsewhere, and it states that, then it's clear to people that there may be some extenuating circumstances. But for example, students who leave, I remember receiving mail at my parents' permanent address for probably 5 or 6 years after I left their address. But I could prove a residence elsewhere all of those 5 or 6 years. So I think that clarifies.
Or perhaps it should say, Mr. Berman brought up a concern after speaking to you that if it just said prove residence elsewhere, that a lot of students would consider their parents' home a residence even though they don't live there. So it says on prove residence at another location where he or she lives for the majority of the year.
Yeah, that actually gets at it better than what we were talking about, which was trying to limit it geographically.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Roberts?
Well, okay, we've had some discussion about some particular details about wording of specific tiny parts of the ordinance, the proposal. I think that it might behoove the council to discuss in general, if this ordinance or proposal is actually achieving what is necessary what is necessary for the maintenance and the viability of the neighborhood in the foresaid quadrant of the city in the west side. I'd be interested in hearing some comments about the general appropriateness of the ordinance, perhaps. And I know that there's a strong feeling that such an ordinance is necessary. Is there any discussion about the purpose of keeping the ordinances to a specific district within the boundaries defined, or is it fairer to the city and the occupants of Urbana to have this ordinance be applied universally to the city and as a whole? Can we answer that question?
Ms. Pat?
I originally proposed that it be applied to the city as a whole because I thought that was more appropriate and fair and et cetera. It was objection raised by members of the committee, I don't remember which ones, to the idea of burdening the whole town with this when it's really just a West Urbana problem or just a campus area problem that led to the proposed change. But if it were the will of those present after hearing public testimony to make this citywide, there would be no argument for me. I do think if we wanted to limit it to the university zone, there is a justification, and that's where the problem is most prevalent and has been documented to be prevalent, but it's not a non-existent problem in the rest of the city. There are, occasionally there are problems with over-occupancy outside of the zone we're defining here.
I do realize this is like a target area, and there have been the most vocal and outspoken individuals in the neighborhood who have had the concern, and I can recognize that and understand it. I haven't had any personal conversations with people feeling that they were either left out or felt particularly targeted by your proposal as far as districting this resolution. But I thought we might at least discuss that.
Ms. General?
Just in response, I think that although I didn't make the proposal originally to zero in on this particular area, I think that our goal is to address the problem and provide the least amount of burden to landowners, landlords, and to the city staff. And so if we saw that this was a problem, particularly a chronic problem in other areas, I think we could consider adding those areas in the future, since all policy we make is somewhat of a living policy, living document. And so in the interest of making it least burdensome to landlords and to the city, I think that this area is special, and our parking regulations show that it's got special issues and problems, and its proximity to the university is really what, and the amount of turnover of rental properties and things like that is what makes it, I think, appropriate for us to zero in on this area. Not necessarily that I would be opposed to expanding it, except I would prefer to start here and then expand as we need, rather than imposing something that creates more paperwork than is absolutely necessary for all involved.
Sorry, Ms. Wyman.
I just want to add a few comments. For those of us who live and represent parts of West Urbana, I think we've been hearing from a lot of the neighbors and a lot of the residents about the problem, and I appreciate Ms. Pat bringing this forward. If those who represent other parts of the city have not been hearing those sorts of complaints from the residents, and it appears you haven't, at least not to the extent the rest of us have, then I think that also provides, in addition to the reasons articulated by the other council members, another reason why it's important at least to start here. I also supported a citywide ordinance when it was brought forth, I believe, 2 weeks ago, but again, I think it was comments from some of the council members who live in other parts of Urbana who said it's really not a problem in our area, or at least that was the impression I got, and that's why it made sense then to try and to scale this back to the area where where the community has at least heard the largest outcry that this is a significant problem and one that needs to be addressed. I think that these proposals certainly address it with the least amount of intervention and least amount of paperwork that anyone could complain of. Again, when people sign leases, this adds just one extra piece of paper. And it clarifies things that, again, several of the people who came and spoke tonight said, we wish we had this, or we're glad this is going to be proposed. It helps to clarify the relationship. It helps to clarify what the law is so that everyone's aware of it. And I think that's also important towards the health, safety, and welfare of our community. One other point I think I'd like to make, and that is regarding the Freedom of Information Act issue that's addressed in number 5 of Ms. Pat's memo, most recent memo. And the statement says, the sentence says, in the interest of reasonable privacy for tenants, the affidavits themselves shall be exempt from any Freedom of Information Act requests, and no tenant affidavit information shall be disclosed by the city unless by court order or in order to prosecute violators. Mr. Holtz suggested that we can't necessarily declare or decide what the Freedom of Information Act what the statute says or doesn't say, but if there's a way to put in a clause, as I would think there would be, to something like, after the words Freedom of Information Act, to say to the extent permissible by law. As case law continually interprets or reinterprets what the statutes say, I think that helps to guide us and to make it clear to anyone who's reading the ordinance that we aren't declaring what the state statute says. We're simply going to follow it and certainly try to protect people's privacy, though the amount of privacy or the information obviously isn't very private at all, as I think Mr. DeBevick pointed out during his public testimony. And I understand also under some rules we've had in other cases or in other issues, specifically our domestic partner benefits program for city employees, we have certain rules, certain information that is kept private and not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. And so I think there are ways, and I'm sure Mr. Holtz has already had to look at this issue, at least in regard to the domestic partner benefits program for city employees, as to what the extent of the FOIA statute is, and so if we can just get language to help protect that or help clarify that, I think that should satisfy that concern. Thank you.
Yeah, I've got maybe a few more questions, and maybe this is one that Steve, you could help me with. This has to do with perhaps the legal wording of the document. Section 4A and B states that a sworn affidavit signed by either the owner or the tenants. Is an affidavit perchance or perforce sworn?
Yeah, it's a little bit redundant, but that's fine.
And I had suggested, I had passed around possible alternative wording for Section 4, number B, striking the first couple of words and beginning with the word tenants at that time of entering into the lease. Then striking the words that they have been and changing that to are to be informed, and then I added in writing by the landlord of the occupancy limits for the house, and that the tenants will not allow the house to be occupied by more than 4 unrelated persons. And then I suggested adding, by signing the lease, the tenants tacitly agree to the occupancy limits set forth in this ordinance. Perhaps my intent was to place the tenants in a position where, by signing the lease and having a written statement as to the occupancy limit of the house, they, by signing the lease, agree to the limitations set forth in the city ordinances. And that has maybe a different feeling than signing a sworn affidavit, and I'm wondering if the council would be, I'm wondering, I guess from the tenant's point of view, they're signing a lease which is basically a legal contract anyways, and then they now discover that they need to sign or swear to this additional information about the occupancy. Is there a way of making it less obtrusive and more inclusive in the lease signing experience by perhaps altering the words in these ways? What are your opinions on that?
Ms. Beth?
I think if we were to make this change, there would be no point in having an ordinance, because well, other than the requirement that the advertising say how many people live in the house, that's something that by itself is of value. But all the rest of this is really about the landlord giving the tenant the information at the time that the tenants sign the lease, and the tenants signing that they had the information, and that verification being sent to the city, because otherwise it won't happen. In those cases where it's not happening now, obviously in other cases it will, but if the tenants...
You're saying that...
What I'm saying is what's happening is, in so many cases, is the landlord is leasing the place to more than 4 people, and the people who get involved in these have no information from anyone other than from the landlord about what's what. So if the landlord tells them, as so many landlords do, as so many tenants tell me landlords tell them, that Urbana has this goofy law that you can't put more than 4 names on the lease, so even though there are going to be 6 of you, we can only put 4 names on the lease, and the tenants say, okay, which they shouldn't, but they don't know better, and sign. That's what's happening. That's how overoccupancy is being fueled year after year. If the landlord signs a statement saying to the city, attesting that he or she did inform the tenants, but didn't really inform the tenants, saying that the tenants having signed the lease is proof they were informed, it's a fiction. The tenants having signed the lease is only proof that the tenants signed the lease. And so having the tenants sign off on the actual information we want them to have, which is, it's against the law to have more than 4 people in this house, and you, the tenant, can be fined if you do that, is the key way to try to stop the prevalence of violations that result from the tenant's ignorance.
So you're looking for a way of verifying the tenant's knowledge?
Yes.
That indeed he knows
right.
If something changes here, he will be in violation.
Right. And also a way of ensuring that they get the information. Because if it were, for example, if it were contained within the lease, if we required that every lease has to state the number of occupants, the short leases are 2 pages long, with 20 clauses, so add another clause. Even if it were the first clause, would people see it? Who knows? If they have to sign a separate document that says hardly anything other than you can't have more than 4 people in this house, that's not a guarantee people will read it, but it increases the likelihood that they will, because it's so short and that's just about all it says. So that's my thinking about this, that it's really more, not that it's more important for the tenant to sign the affidavit than the landlord, but the idea is that it's for both of them to, because that's the way we know that the tenant was informed. Otherwise, we could be in a situation like, and this is what some of the property owners were suggesting tonight, well, that we change the law so you can punish the landlord, so why don't we just go ahead and do that and see if that works. That's still not going to solve the problem of 6 people are occupying the house, and if that's illegal, the city's going to make 2 get out. Even if nothing else happens, even if they don't get fined, they still have to move right after they've moved in, and it disrupts the household, it disrupts their lives. If we could prevent that from happening, if we could prevent the leasing from happening, the illegal leasing from happening in the first place, that would be the most effective way to address this problem.
Is there an indication that these affidavits have to be filed with the clerk? Is that written here in the document?
Can I say that? Just a second. I believe it does, but I'm sorry, I'm looking at yours.
Paragraph 4. Owner shall file with the city.
Oh, yeah,
the documents themselves could have the address for the city on each of them.
That would be useful, probably.
It's just
Sorry, what?
I was just saying the affidavits themselves could just have the address and name that it should be sent to. Please send these documents to at the bottom.
Right, but the program description,
Yes.
if this were converted to an ordinance, says each time a house is leased, the owner shall file with the city, A, that's the owner affidavit, and B, the tenant affidavit.
But if it's on the affidavit, it'll be a friendly reminder.
Yeah.
Are there any other comments?
I had one question for Mr. Holtz. I don't think we
Beth?
asked him, and that has to do with this issue of not doing this citywide, but doing it just in a specific district. Do you know an answer?
Yeah, we did look at it some this afternoon. I don't think there's any great difficulty in doing it, restricting it to a particular geographical area. It would be, in my view, important to have some kind of record justification for restricting it in that way. I'm not sure that the 20-year-old study would be enough. There seems to be that there would need to be something more recent, at least in the form of findings by the city council. And but I think that it would be legal for the city to do that. And we've done it in other contexts. We've done it with our special parking zones and things like that. So yeah, I think it's something.
Kick some of those people out. I don't want 4 of the 7 complaints this year were over occupancies, so that's 4 households that were disruptive, and that was 4 to 8 people who had significant hardship caused in their lives. and they were, I don't know this for a fact in each of those cases, but I wouldn't be surprised if in each of those cases they were the innocent victims of a business person's deceptive practices. Now, we've only finally, just this year, acknowledged that the deceptive practice is unlawful, and we put that into our zoning ordinance, but we'll still have the consequence. If once the place is rented to too many people, we'll still have the consequence of innocent victims being the ones to pay the price. And that is what this is really seeking to address, is to try, basically, the primary purpose of this ordinance is prevention, to prevent the over-occupancy in the first place, which is ideally what we want to do in all cases. And the main purpose of the fines is prevention. It's to scare people.
Yeah.
More than it is to collect the fines. The ultimate goal here is actually to reduce staff time spent dealing with this particular kind of problem, and to reduce the number of complaints and the amount of staff time on enforcement, which would be the case if, in fact, the problems arose less often. And so, obviously, it wouldn't solve every problem, and it wouldn't solve the problem of, like that Mr. Fine described, of being rented a house for 4 people, but thinking it was for 7, and going ahead and putting in, what do you say, 10 or 12? I don't know, whatever. Yeah, if that, I don't know how much that happens, but the degree that happens, that would probably, well, actually, I don't know if that would keep happening. That still might even be reduced some, because if people really, really know that the city's serious about it, it might make a difference. But this would definitely put a dent in the standard operating procedure of a lot of owners of single-family homes, just renting the house to 5 or 6 people, because that's what they do, and they don't see that there's any consequence in doing it differently, and the tenants doing it because they don't even know what's going on. At least the tenants will be informed, and the owner will think twice.
Well, I do think that the very strongest paragraph in the whole ordinance could be the truth in advertising, number 6. That is so straightforwardly appropriate. I mean, I have to give you great credit for putting that in. Okay. I think I'm done.
Mr. Hayes?
Well, I'm not totally against this ordinance. There's a question came to my mind a few minutes ago, wherein if a person has a house and they rent it out to 5, 6, or 7 people, and then they sell that house to another individual, and when you figure out how much the business worth, the number of years times the profit minus your loss, and multiply that, and then you get how much it's worth. And so my question is, if somebody who's been renting rooms 5, 6, and 7, at that time, the assessor assesses the property at the rate that the new individual bought the house, okay? Because it's going according to market rate. And so my question is, when you limit the number of rooms that can be rented out to 4 unrelated people, there's not a mechanism in place to reduce the value of the property because of the business transaction.
So, Mr. Hayes, are you saying, basically what you're saying is that if a house is overoccupied and the owner sells it to someone else who is going to follow the law, that they're not going to, that the house would sell for less because...
No, it might not sell for less, but he's paying based on the 6 or 7 people in the house. But then when you limit him to only 4 people unrelated, okay, then he's paying taxes based on what the business formula was, and he's not going to be able to recoup the losses. I'm not saying doing anything about it. I'm just saying that, since we're talking about this, we ought to talk about, who all is affected.
Well, the tax on real estate isn't based on like say, if you were to buy a house on the 700 block of Illinois Street, the price is, or the tax you pay is going to be based on the sales price of
market value,
of houses in the, I don't know how big an area they do, but so how much you bought the house for is going to be a factor in how much tax you pay on it, as well as how much the other half a dozen people in the immediate area around you paid for their houses. So,
but the taxes you pay is going to be more than what you had anticipated because your profit's going to be less.
If once you bought the house, you stopped doing illegal. That could be true. Is that true?
Are there any other comments? If not, is a motion in order?
You ready? Go ahead.
I move we send this to council with asking, sorry, you would think we should...
This is a program. Let's ask the staff.
Ask the staff to turn this into an ordinance. So that's obviously legal. That's going to need to do that, and I don't know if that's something that can be then come to council or needs to come to probably the next committee meeting. He's shaking his head yes. So I move to send this to staff with a request to, or with direction to create an ordinance based on this proposal. And the input from other council members as described or as discussed at this meeting, with hopes that we'll see this at the next committee meeting in 2 weeks. So moved.
Second.
The motion and a second. Is there any additional discussion? I have one comment I'd like to make, and that's that the previous version of this that was brought I considered excessively odious in proportion to what it was attempted to solve, and I think those who are proposing this have done a pretty good job at, I think, targeting it to what the perceived problem is. The argument that I find most compelling, and I, again, am pretty lukewarm in my support of this just because I feel that additional regulation in the face of a recent change to the ordinance already may not be appropriate, but the argument I found most compelling was the argument that Mr. Berman raised about competitive advantage, which was that, I think we have an obligation to recognize that there are law-abiding landlords in the West Urbana neighborhood. We heard from some of them tonight who keep their properties up and who, rent to students who get along with their neighbors and who eventually maybe become homeowners in the neighborhood or landlords themselves and really try to make a positive contribution to the neighborhood. And I think we have an obligation to them to do what we can do to ensure that landlords who are not responsible members of the neighborhood and who do knowingly overlease these properties have to play in the same competitive arena that the law-abiding landlords do. So it's pretty much solely on the basis of that I'm going to be willing to support this and see this move forward. There's no further comment. Do we do a roll call vote or a voice vote?
Voice vote.
All in favor of moving this forward, please signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed? The motion carries. Move on to agenda item number 6 now. Ordinance number 2005-02-026, an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute an agreement with the City of Champaign and University of Illinois respecting floodplain remapping of the Boneyard Creek, First Amendment. This comes from Public Works.
Can I just say one thing? As Mr. Gray's coming up, I don't know what other council members think since we've spent 3.5 hours speaking on the first agenda item, but if the other, it's always good to hear from the public, but as it's nearly 11 o'clock for the next items, I don't know what other council members feel about just sending the rest of these items to council without a recommendation. But Mr. Gray is up here, just a thought for before we come to the following
I'm
item.
not terribly familiar with the procedure. My feeling is we at least should get some sense of what these are before we move them forward.
Okay.
But,
certainly wouldn't be any problem to send them on to council without a recommendation. I don't think any of them are controversial.
should we call them for discussion? Should we call them out and then pass them forward? We need to at least have action on each item.
Mr. Chair, we have 4 minutes before the meeting's up. I think that's why Ms. Wyman made that suggestion, that we do, since the action would be to send these things to council. The only reason to not do that would be if someone didn't want to send it to council. Although, if everything were sent to city council, at city council, 2 people could still defer it if they weren't ready to take action, and a majority, of course, could always postpone consideration. But I don't, if, I'd be willing to go along with that. I'd be willing to extend time. It's just we are going to have to extend the meeting if we're going to go through all of these.
Is there a general sentiment on the council? I hate to see that we abandon the majority of our business in favor of looking at one issue, but if people feel that it's not appropriate to extend, then we have no other choice.
I'm going to extend at least 11:15.
I'll second.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to be recognized? I'm sorry. Ms. Chenoweth?
I have a few questions, and I'd be happy to ask the staff members directly between now and next Monday, so that might be an idea for council members, committee members who have questions, is they can actually email or phone staff about them. I'd be fine with moving these without recommendation at this point.
I have another question.
Mr. Roberts.
I guess the other option we would have is take them up at the next committee session. Never just move them to the next.
We'll see.
Is that appropriate?
Ms. Wyman?
We could certainly do that, but I think that given the information that I've read in the packet on these items is that they're not so controversial that they'll actually each need an hour or 2 of debate, hopefully.
Okay.
So
I can see that.
And that way this will stay on the schedule that staff had anticipated, I think, sending it first to committee and then final approval at council. So it stays on the schedule, but it allows council members to get home before midnight.
If the council would indulge me, given that we've given that we've agreed to extend for 15 minutes, I think it's quite likely that we can probably get through these items in 15 minutes, and I'd prefer to call them in the agenda order.
That's fine.
Thank you. Mr. Gray?
I'll try to be very brief. I apologize that for the boneyard remapping for the floodplain, the amendment number 1 had a few, I'll call them typographical errors in them. And if you could pull out that amendment number 1 and the final version for council consideration, if it goes to council, we'll have these corrections. But we inserted in the first paragraph the ordinance number that was lacking in the first paragraph. Secondly, in the third, whereas we inserted a clearer reference as to what existing agreement we're talking about. In the page 2, section 14, paragraph 2, there's a typo. The not to exceed amount is $120,000. And on page 3, the first paragraph at the top, if contours are obtained through another source or means, the result of the same shall be delivered. Insert the words no later than September 30th, 2005. Putting that aside, what is before you is an agreement with the City of Champaign and the University of Illinois to look at remapping the Boneyard Creek floodplain in its entirety. There have been substantial multi-million-dollar improvements that have been completed on campus and in the City of Champaign. The floodplain has shrunk considerably, especially in Champaign and on campus, somewhat so in Urbana. What this would do, it's a very detailed, elaborate process, and we would employ the United States Geological Survey local office to do this study. The beauty of using them would be they would obtain cooperator funding, so 50% of this study would be funded by the federal government, and then we would split the local cost of $120,000 per percentages that were established in the Boneyard Agreement back in 2001. So our share, not to exceed, would be $42,000. This is a multi-year process by the time we would get FEMA approval. The timing is somewhat critical, too, because FEMA has embarked on a cooperative program to digitize all the existing floodplain maps, and we feel it would be somewhat of a waste to do that because the floodplain has changed so much so for the Boneyard Creek. So we would like to work with them and not have them go through that process of digitizing the existing floodplain, but rather to cooperate with us and the Department of Natural Resources in coming up with a new floodplain, a more precise, exact floodplain. Also, in concert with this study will be some new aerial photography that will be occurring this spring, which is part of the GIS consortium. And an additional component of that aerial photography will be that we would request 2-foot contours to occur, and that would give exact ground elevations that USGS would use in coming up with this new floodplain. So those are expenses that are identified in the budget. They're part of the GIS consortium expenses that we are a party to. But this all works quite nicely with the new aerial mapping, the 2-foot contours. USGS would be the party doing the study. The City of Champaign will be discussing this with their City Council soon. The University of Illinois is on board to pay their portion too. So, in benefits to us in shrinking the floodplain, especially in the area around Lincoln Avenue, does help with floodplain insurance. Some property owners have mortgages. You have to have floodplain insurance if you have property in the floodplain. And also there could be opportunities for other developments or redevelopments that may occur within the core of Urbana here, closer to the floodplain, that by existing floodplain definitions would be prohibited from happening. So there are some benefits that we would see too.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Gray? Mr. Hayes?
Yeah, the first one is minor, on page 3 of the agreement.
Yes.
The next to the last line on the first paragraph, the results of the same shall be delivered then September 30, 2005.
Yeah, insert the word please no later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That was one of our typos.
Any additional?
On page 4. Now, this agreement is going to be between the U of I, Urbana, Champaign, Regional Planning Commission, and the U.S. Geological Survey. So, item number 6 on page 4. During the course of this program, all field and analytical work of either party pertaining to this program shall be open to the inspection of the other party. And if the work is not being carried out in a mutually satisfactory manner, either party may terminate this agreement upon 60 days written notice to the other party. And so my question is, if everybody is going to get together and have this meeting and agree on what has to be done, then how do you separate one party not being responsible for getting part of the stuff done?
First of all, this page 4 is not actually part of amendment number 1. This is a standalone document that I just wanted to include, that we have a joint funding agreement with the city and the USGS. So this is not actually amendment number 1. This is just a standalone agreement. And USGS will have a similar joint funding agreement with the City of Champaign and also with the University of Illinois. So this delineates the specific payment amounts in the various fiscal years that will be paying USGS to perform this $240,000 study. So that may not be answering your question directly, but I just wanted to...
Each one will have a separate agreement?
Yes. Each one will have a separate agreement. That's correct.
But they're going to agree on...
But in this amendment, we're all agreeing that we're going to abide by these percentages to pay not to exceed an amount of $120,000.
Okay.
So we're committing to that.
Okay.
Ms. Wyman?
I move to send this to council with a recommendation for approval.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? I'd just like to make the comment that I think this seems like a great way to work to get some value out of projects that are going on with other agencies anyway. Congratulations on being able to put this together. There are no further comments. Do we need a roll call on this either?
Since it's all committee,
Okay,
it always
thank you. All in favor of moving this forward, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That goes forward to council. The next agenda item is resolution number 2005-02-005, a resolution to endorse the Champaign Urbanized Area Transportation Study Long-Range Transportation Plan 2025.
There's a lot you could say about this item, and I'll just keep it very brief. But basically, this is the final document, the long-range transportation plan. In my years working here, this is certainly the most comprehensive document we've put together to date. A tribute to the CUOT staff members. Very good, a lot of input, a lot of good map, a lot of information. This is updated every 5 years. I think the public input into this process was extensive, and there's just a lot of good information. So there is a CD-ROM that we can make available. We didn't print this out because this is $80 of printing, so we thought we'd save a few dollars by that. It is on the website if anyone is interested. The memo before you, I think, kind of highlights what is in here, and basically what we're asking council here is, when it's all said and done, do you endorse or not endorse this LRTP? Keep in mind that this long-range transportation plan is required, at least for CUOT's policy members, to approve for receiving federal funds. We have to update this every 5 years, but this is by far a great document that will not gather dust in my office anyway. It'll be used often.
Any questions, Mr. Hayes?
Did this, we get the problem with the university solved?
If you're referring to the Curtis Road one, the answer is yes. This council approved that letter of understanding. I'm still waiting. I think there's 5 agency signatures. I don't have all 5 agency signatures yet, but to my knowledge, they will all be signing.
Ms. Pat?
Thank you. I don't know if this could be a simple question. It was my impression that the use of 130 as the eastern boundary on the arterial fringe road was something that was still being discussed.
Studied, yes.
Studied, yeah. And now this map shows the portion north of north of whatever that is.
Interstate 74?
Yeah, is that the interstate? Yeah, right there. Yeah, north of the interstate is the study area. But from looking at it, it appears that what we're saying is the preferred alternative is that 130 would be the arterial fringe south of the interstate, and it's just a matter of studying whether it would be north. Is that what we're saying here?
Yes.
Is it? It was my impression from at one point actually that's what I thought, but then in looking at the comprehensive plan, which I realize is different, but the city's comprehensive plan, it looked like that's still something that we're looking at, something partway between Cottonwood and 130 or at Cottonwood, or that it just isn't determined yet, but this looks like it is determined. So how does our comprehensive plan fit in with all this?
Well, I don't know if Rob wants to address this or not, but well, you're a little more familiar with the comp plan than I don't have that picture in my mind right at the moment.
There have been a number of different proposals or comments from mostly residents about what would be a logical location for a ring road or a beltway, or if we wanted to go with some kind of concept like that. Our comp plan, we've tried to keep it consistent with this plan, but we have pretty much taken out the, references to high-speed ring roads or beltways, et cetera, but do recognize that there does need to be additional study on High Cross Road north of the interstate, which we are doing with CUATS and the 130 corridor plan. The comp plan does identify the completion of the University Avenue I-74 interchange to be, further studied to determine an optimal location and design for that. But I think in our comp plan, we've backed off the notion of the high-speed ring road quite a bit.
As far as the notion of the high-speed ring road, it's not intended to be like a beltway around the city, but more a roadway, and that's why I think the name was changed, a roadway that would meet the need in that particular area. And, not necessarily on 130, but when we were talking with the university about Curtis Road, and they were worried about, well, what is this going to be? Are we going to have 4 lanes, 2 in each direction, separated by a median, and going through the South Farms? And we said, well, no, probably something like that is not going to happen unless there's the development on one end or the other, or both ends, probably to warrant it. If it's going to be cornfields, experimental cornfields throughout the entire stretch, it's probably going to stay a 2-lane road, even though it may be designated as an arterial through there as well. And so, I think it's a misconception to think of, a ring road in the sense of some other bigger cities where there's a beltway, a 4-lane beltway all around the city. And here, the use and the design would change based on the type of development in that particular area. If it's rural and agricultural, it'll be a much different configuration than if it's urban and industrial or commercial. And so in designating that was the idea in designating Curtis, but then 130 is designated as that fringe arterial on the east side. It exists already, so there's no plan to really change it unless development warrants it, like for where the Walmart is going, why they're going to need to upgrade 130 with turn lanes and so forth, and so it's going to have to be changed as development warrants it. North of 130, and I know that's the study area right now, and that there was a proposal to connect the ring road or all the way 360 degrees all the way around town, but that's another area where it just doesn't make sense to have spend millions of dollars on a roadway when it doesn't really serve anything other than residential growth, which doesn't need a high-speed roadway in there. So that's why that's listed as a study area, because I think there are a lot of concerns there. From our planning perspective and where we put our transportation dollars, I don't think anybody has an idea that we're going to be putting any transportation dollars north of I-74 on High Cross Road. Just doesn't make any sense for us.
Can I say follow-up?
And then I think Ms. Chenoweth has to acknowledge, so Esther.
First you said that it wouldn't be high-speed. I guess my concern is that if this were actually a high-speed road, and then we think of something like 465 around Indianapolis, then High Cross really would not be an appropriate place, because there will be so many breaks we're planning in the comprehensive plan. That's why I'm a little confused about this, and maybe I'm mixing up the discussions from the two, that we're planning residential development along High Cross, we're going to have commercial, but there'll be lots of curb cuts, so that wouldn't be something that we would want as a high-speed corridor. Is it?
Depends on what you mean by high speed. We're not talking about an interstate. High speed is probably, what we have along Windsor Road right now. And I think the design of 130, even though there is a plan for residential in certain areas and commercial in certain areas, there'll probably be a limit, and Bill probably knows this better than I know, there'll be a limit on the number of curb cuts. So you wouldn't want driveways accessing out onto 130, a residential driveway, but you'd want a road that would access those residential developments or commercial developments.
If I could interject, we're almost out of time again. Is it the impression of the council that this is something that is is worthy enough of further discussion that we might want to forward this to a future committee meeting? Or can Mr. Green give us a sense of the timeliness of this issue? I certainly think that after several hours of discussing this rental registration program, it's not appropriate to blow off the Kuat study in a couple of minutes. And if people think that this is worthy of future discussion, I would certainly entertain a motion to move this forward to a future committee.
I would make that motion.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. In recognition of the lateness of the hour, and I think the relative difference between the previous two agenda items, which I think were issues of considerable importance with regard to physical planning, and the remainder, which I believe are more administrative issues, I'd be amenable to a motion to move the remaining agenda items forward to council.
I so move without a recommendation.
I would second that.
All in favor of moving ordinance number 2005-2-027R with regard to the Morrow Building, ordinance number 2005-02-028 and 029, formalizing parking lot designations and regarding parking time limit on certain streets, forward to council with no recommendation, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? There being no further business before us, we're adjourned.
Yeah, what were you doing?